Chapter 22-28. Although Li Fengmu's injuries were more serious, blind left and blind right did not have it easy either. Both of them had a sword scar on their bodies. It was caused by Li Fengmu using the heaven sword in his hand. This was also why blind left and blind right knew that their warriors were being slaughtered by a martial emperor, but they did not dare to divert their attention to deal with him. If they didn't join forces, who knew what kind of terrible things would happen? Previously, they had also gone to learn about this place and knew that there were two monstrous geniuses here. However, they did not expect that this old man would be so difficult to deal with. It was not because this old man was strong, but because his sword was too sharp. Just now it was just sword chi, but it left deep scars on their bodies. How could they dare to divide their forces? Although there were also extremely powerful martial emperors among the Grey Wolf warriors, they were all at the first level. However, in front of jade-faced White Robe, they seemed a little aggrieved. They also tried to stop him, but in the end they were only hit by his sword. That sword also made them tremble with fear, and they did not dare to be careless. Originally, they thought that they could get a big advantage by following the White Bear clan this time. Who would have thought that they would be in such a situation just at the beginning? If this continued, they did not know how much damage they would suffer. The more they thought about it, the more anxious blind left and blind right felt. If they had known that there were so many experts here, they would have mobilized more experts here, and they would not be in such a sorry state. It seems that we have to end the battle quickly. Otherwise, if we continue to delay, I'm afraid the situation will become worse, Blind Right said with some worry. Many of the warriors he brought had already died. If this continued, there would only be more casualties. As long as the pillar of the Sword Heart realm was defeated, then this world would directly collapse. In the face of their attacks, it would not have the slightest ability to resist. It could be said that Li Fengmu was the only pillar of the Sword Heart realm now, and he was the most important one. If he was gone, then the Sword Heart realm might really lose its protection. Blind Left nodded with a solemn expression. He was naturally aware of the changes in the scene. However, who would have thought that things would be so unpredictable? A small world that they did not have to worry about was actually so full of hidden dragons and crouching tigers, with such powerful experts. After this battle is over, we have to make things clear with the White Bear clan and ask them for more things. Otherwise, how can we face these dead brothers? Left said his heart was full of unwillingness. Blind Right said, of course. Li Fengmu complained in his heart as he listened to the two's casual conversation. He did not know how long he could hold on. If the reinforcements from the divine realm did not arrive, then the situation would become even worse. As such, he had no choice but to ponder over these changes. In the blink of an eye, Blind Left and Blind Right exchanged glances. Immediately, their auras began to undergo a huge change. In the blink of an eye, they revealed their true appearances. Two enormous wolves landed on the ground. When left, the earth tremor, the ground, left and the earth, and them. Left and left, and he left. Left right he. His opponent showed his true form, which meant that he was going to go all out. Next, they would still have to fight against him. How long they could hold him off was really an unknown. The current him could be said to be extremely helpless. Fine. Even if I have to risk my life, I will make sure that you two can't live on, Li Fengmu said coldly, and the heaven sword in his hand made a sound. In fact, Li Fengmu knew very well that only Left Blind and Right Blind could threaten the Sword Heart realm now. As long as they were killed, Bai Jian and the others would be able to quell the chaos of the battle. As for what kind of problems the Sword Heart world would face in the future, it was not something that Li Fengmu could worry about now. After all, if he could not survive the current situation, how could there be a future? Instantly, countless sword auras soared into the sky. Li Fengmu was prepared. It was just a life and death struggle. What was there to be afraid of? In that instant, the subtle change in his aura caused Left Blind and Right Blind to be shocked. They did not expect this old man to be so powerful. However, the arrow was knocked on the bowstring and had to be released. Suddenly, a golden light streaked across the sky and pierced into the ground, blocking in front of Li Fengmu, Blind Right and Blind Left. When Li Fengmu saw the sword, a very satisfied smile appeared on his face. He knew that his persistence had paid off. The reinforcements had finally arrived. Bai Jian, who was fighting hard to kill the enemy, also saw the dawn of hope at this moment. Their sword heart world was not destined to die. It could be said that even Bai Jian did not expect that the reinforcements would be her. Immediately, he felt endless pain coming from his body. Although Bai Jian was unstoppable in the battle formation, he had already suffered a lot of heavy blows. He had been hiding his strength all this time so that he could kill as many enemies as possible so that his comrades would not die. Left and Right Blind Right looked at the sharp sword on the ground, which was still glowing with golden light, and their hearts could not help but sink again. They could already feel the sharpness of a sword aura. Could it be that there was another problem? Could there be some almighty figure in this small world? Soon, the two of them sensed a powerful aura rapidly approaching them. What should we do? Blind Right said with a trembling voice. The situation had completely exceeded their expectations. If they continue to fight, then there might be a slight change in this sure-win situation. Your Blue Wolf clan is really useless. Mr. Bai was right. You guys are really useless. Suddenly, an ear-piercing voice was heard. When Left and Right Blind heard this, they looked sideways and saw a man in a purple robe walking over slowly. Behind him was an army of thousands. I didn't expect it to be Brother Niu. If you had appeared earlier, our battle wouldn't have been so anxious and our Blue Wolf clan wouldn't have lost so many brothers, Left Blind said with some dissatisfaction. Blind Right remained silent because he knew that he had been used by the White Bear clan this time. Not only had they suffered heavy losses, but their credit had also been stolen by others. He felt very uncomfortable. Chapter 22-29. Li Fengmu's heart sank when he saw the purple-robed man leading thousands of troops. Initially, he thought that the tables had turned, but the tables had turned too quickly. It seemed that the balance had tilted once again. Li Fengmu felt extremely helpless. He could only hope that the Almighty could bring more troops from the realm of the gods. Otherwise, they would not be able to withstand the enemy's ferocious attacks. Even Bai Jian's expression could not help but turn a lot uglier. It could be said that he did not expect the other party to have a backup plan in this invasion. The Ash Wolf clan was probably just the vanguard. Now that the real army had arrived, how could they resist? The purple-robed man quickly joined the battle. He glanced coldly at the elderly man who was holding the sword. His gaze quickly fell on the sharp sword that was glowing with golden light. Although the person had not arrived, the sword was already there. Moreover, the sword was not simple. Its mere appearance was enough to make people fearful. You two pieces of trash. You can't even take down this old man together. The purple-robed man snorted in disdain and said disdainfully. Blind Left and Blind Right smiled helplessly. If the opponent was really an ordinary person, they would have defeated him long ago. However, the main point was, how could this person be an ordinary person as the master of a realm? At the end of the day, their setback this time was due to their lack of preparation. They had underestimated the person who had ascended from a small realm. Originally, they thought that they were just chickens and pottery dogs that could be easily defeated. However, only now did they realize that their thinking was wrong. It could even be said that it was a huge mistake. However, at this point, it was useless to say anything. They could only quickly take down the Sword Heart world. At that time, they might be able to get a share of the loot. Otherwise, they might not be able to reap any benefits, not to mention the loss of their troops. It was a good thing that Mr. White had a trick up his sleeve. Otherwise, the Ash Wolf clan would have suffered a great loss here. In fact, in the end, they might even collapse and suffer a crushing defeat. Brother Niao, now is not the time to pursue the matter. It is more important to take down this place first, Blind Left said worriedly. Blind Zhua was more worried that these people would stab him in the back. Moreover, most of the credit would be gone. Hence, he naturally had to think of a way to keep the remaining credit in his hands. Otherwise, this time, the Ashwolf clan might really have put in a lot of effort without gaining any benefits. The purple-robed man coldly snorted in disdain. In his eyes, the two of them were usually very arrogant, but they were just SOSO. How powerful could a martial king who had ascended from a small realm be? Although there were some discrepancies in the information, it did not affect the battle situation. In the blink of an eye, a golden light flashed, and a white-clothed woman appeared beside the sword. Her slender, jade-like hand gently rested on the sword's hilt. Blind Left and Blind and Right could not help swallowing their saliva. They began to mumble. As far as they knew, there was only one stage, 3 powerhouse in the Four Realms Alliance. Why were there 2 of them now? Wasn't this difference a little too big? The purple-robed man still had a look of disdain. In his opinion, so what if the other party was a 3rd-level martial king? There was still one more person on their side. When Li Fengmu saw that Princess Mingzhu came alone, he could not help but frown. Although Princess Mingzhu's current talent and strength were unparalleled, it was still not enough for her to turn the tide by herself. In front of such a big event, the Sword Heart world might be destroyed. How could Li Fengmu not feel distressed? In the end, Li Fengmu could only suppress this thought, since he already had the resolve to replace Left Blind and Right Blind. Then it would be enough to let her deal with the new purple-robed man who had just joined the battle. Princess Mingzhu slowly pulled out her sword. She pointed the sword forward and said coldly, "Who wants to see if my sword is sharp?" As soon as she said that, a sharp aura surged out without any concealment. This was because Xiaoyang had said that the battle here might be a diversion. She had to end the battle quickly. Moreover, she did not see any warrior from the White Bear tribe. She was even more certain that Xiaoyang's prediction was correct. Li Fengmu suddenly laughed out loud. His energy was greatly boosted. Since he could fight side by side with Princess Mingzhu, it could be said that it was a blessing in life. They did not have as many experts as the other party. It was meaningless to think so much now. Therefore, it was already a blessing to be able to force them to retreat. Otherwise, if they could severely injure these ignorant beasts, they would let them know how powerful they were. Only in this way could they make the final contribution. This was the worst plan. In the face of the woman's aggressive aura, the purple-robed man was stunned for a moment. Then he came back to his senses, and the corner of his mouth was full of sarcasm. These guys really did not know what was good for them. They knew nothing about the power of the 3,000 middle worlds. Otherwise, how could they be so calm now? All right, then let me see what your cultivation is like. The purple-robed man shouted. As soon as he finished speaking, the purple-robed man's robe began to surge crazily. It was as if there was an uncontrollable power that was about to explode. Princess Mingzhu's expression did not change at all. It was as if she was watching a child showing off his skills. Princess Mingzhu dared to boast that she was invincible among those in the same realm. Naturally, she had her own unique understanding. In the next moment, under the dazzling golden light, she drew her sword. The sword chi was extremely overbearing. On the other side of the battle, Xiaoyang and Beilizhen had exchanged blows a few times. Both of them had their wins and losses. However, the situation was very bad for Beilizhen. This was because Xiaoyang had killed a few white bears in addition to dealing with them. It could be said that he had made use of every opportunity to make Beilizhen unable to defend against him, even if they revealed their true forms. So what? With the gap between their realms and the power of the Thunderfire Divine Sword who could block Xiaoyang's attack. In other words, other than Beilizhen, the rest were merely ants. Chapter 2230. Bailey Zhen's heart was filled with unwillingness as he looked at the corpses of the fallen warriors. Although he had already given it his all, it was still difficult to resist such a battle situation. His heart could be said to be extremely helpless. This lad was too strong. He was invincible, as expected of the person who was able to kill Bailey Foam. His strength was also not to be underestimated. Therefore, Bailey Zhen's heart was filled with doubt. Is he really a second-order martial emperor? If that was the case, how could his strength be so terrifying? These questions made him very puzzled. Could it be that all the cultivators who had ascended from the 3,000 small worlds were monstrous? Was that why they could be so powerful? Was it normal for them to challenge people who were at a higher level? The more Bailey Zhen thought about it, the more panicked he became. This was because he felt that this was indeed a little strange. Moreover, with his current thinking and knowledge, it was indeed difficult for him to understand. What was the reason for all of this? Things had changed a little too quickly. The rest of the White Bear warriors had already begun to tremble. In the face of a martial emperor, they really had no ability to resist. If it was only a difference of 1 or 2 small realms, they might still be able to struggle and resist. However, the gap between realms made them feel like children. It was impossible for them to resist. It could be said that in a battle, the strength of the top combatants determined the outcome of the battle. Moreover, there was a high possibility that this was the case. Bailey Zhen looked at the sword wound on his chest and gritted his teeth in hatred. Do you think you can defeat me like this? Bailey Zhen roared angrily. He had already given his all, but he had not expected to be injured even more severely in the end. His opponent looked as if he had only suffered some superficial wounds. He was not affected at all. Xiao Yong only laughed disdainfully. He acknowledged his opponent's strength. Originally, he had 2 chances to kill him, but he didn't expect that he would be able to block them both. This was not unexpected. A powerhouse naturally had many tricks up his sleeve. However, after wasting so much time, he still could not take down his opponent. This made him feel a little impatient. Although Xiao Yang didn't notice the appearance of a new enemy, he was certain that the other party wouldn't be just a small skirmish. Otherwise, how could he be worthy of such a big battle? Xiao Yang did not know why his opponent had not made a move yet. However, he felt that it would be a good thing if he could end this battle as soon as possible. What else can I do? Xiao Yang snorted coldly. Looking at his opponent's disdain, Bailey Zhen's heart was starting to go crazy. Being looked down upon like this, he naturally did not feel good in his heart. However, the defeat he suffered in the previous battle made him even more aware that if he continued to fight in the same way as before, he would most likely end up in a situation where he would definitely die. How could he, Bailey Zhen, accept it? Good. What an arrogant brat. I'd like to see how you're going to deal with this. Since I dared to come here, I naturally have a way to deal with you. Bailey Zhen shouted hysterically. Xiao Yang's state of mind did not change at all in the face of his opponent's frenzy. However, he had already defeated his opponent. It was only a matter of time before he killed them. As for what his opponent was saying, he didn't really care about it. If there were no other reinforcements, then Bailey Zhen's army would naturally be wiped out here. Formation. When Bailey Zhen saw that his opponent was still looking down on him, he almost lost his mind. He really couldn't tolerate this kind of thing any longer. Moreover, he remembered his mission, which was to kill Xiao Yang to atone for his mistake. This time he had come fully prepared. If he still couldn't complete this task, then even if he returned alive, he would probably be looked down upon by others. At that time, his status would plummet. Although his status had plummeted, this was a chance to make up for it. With this loud shout, the dozen White Bear warriors also began to rush forward. In the blink of an eye, they formed a circle, each of them bursting with extremely powerful strength. The strength of these people was not low. If they were to form a formation, they would also be able to give others a headache. Previously, Xiao Yang had only used a few treasures to set up the heavenly cycle formation and let Mu Yang control it. He even had the strength to fight against Han Jingming. This showed how powerful the formation was. How powerful would the White Bear warriors be when they formed a formation? Then, Xiaoyang shook the divine sword in his hand and charged forward. It looked like he was going to kill all the White Bear warriors. Once they were all dead, he would not be able to continue setting up the formation. Haha, kid, are you afraid? Bailey Zhen laughed when he saw that his opponent had almost lost his mind. While he was talking, he was also laughing. However, his body did not stop at all as he quickly pounced toward Xiaoyang. Bailey Zhen was not muddle-headed. If he did not stop Xiaoyang, he was afraid that the people he had brought with him would all be killed by Xiaoyang in an instant. When that happened, he would not be able to save the situation on his own. Bailey Zhen naturally knew how to make a choice. Just in time. Xiaoyang was also secretly delighted. He had an ulterior motive for this move. Plunder like fire. In an instant, Xiaoyang turned into a ray of fire. The tip of his sword shifted and slashed towards Bailey Zhen. At this moment, Bailey Zhen's heart trembled. He did not expect this kid to be targeting him all along. Bailey Zhen roared again and again. Waves of energy surged out from his body. It was as if the ocean was gushing out from his body. It was unstoppable. No matter how sharp Xiaoyang's attacks were, Bailey Zhen's progress slowed down in the face of such tyrannical power. Bailey Zhen no longer retreated. Instead, he slapped down with his palm. Boom! Xiaoyang could not withstand such a huge force. He was instantly knocked back and did not have the strength to continue his unfinished attack. Thunder Bear Formation. Chapter 2231. When Xiaoyang was forced to retreat, the array below had already been completed. The dozen or so white bears stood there like statues. However, in the middle of them there was a huge white bear. Its body was flashing with lightning, and it looked very shocking. It was a physical entity formed by the power of the white bears. Its power was extraordinary, and it was comparable to that of a martial emperor. After seeing this scene, Xiaoyang couldn't help but feel a little surprised. He did not expect the White Bear tribe to have such an ingenious technique. Xiaoyang did not expect this either. However, how much of an impact could this power, which was comparable to a level 1 martial emperor, have on him? Could it be that such a formation alone could cause such a drastic change in the situation? Wasn't this a little too wishful thinking? However, Xiaoyang was not careless. He did not think that anyone was a fool. Since the other party dared to do this, it meant that there must be something ingenious about it. Although he had not discovered it yet, he still had to be careful to avoid any mishaps. Haha, you've lost. Bailey Zhen laughed loudly, completely ignoring the sword wound on his lower abdomen. In the next moment, Bailey Zhen's body flashed, and he entered the huge Thunder Bear. When Xiaoyang saw this scene, he suddenly understood that the formation created by the White Bear warriors was meant to focus on Bailey Zhen in order to increase his strength. He did not expect such an ingenious technique to appear in this place. After Bailey Zhen merged with the Lightning Bear's aura underwent an earth-shattering change. Wherever its aura reached, it suffocated everyone. Even some of the mountain peaks in the far southern paradise were blasted into powder by the lightning. Countless birds and beasts prostrated themselves on the ground, not daring to move at all. They were terrified to the extreme. Feeling Bailey Zhen's aura rising rapidly, Xiaoyang could not help but gasp. It seemed that he had been too careless. Naturally, these fellows were not ordinary people. They had underestimated their opponents. Soon, Bailey Zhen's aura had reached its peak. His aura had become extremely ferocious and vast. It was as if he had already won, and his eyes were full of confidence. Boy, my strength is now infinitely close to level 4 martial emperor. Now, how could you possibly be a match for me? Bailey Zhen laughed confidently. At this point, it was time for him to hold his head high. The previous defeat was only in the past. As long as he could kill his opponent now, it would no longer be a problem. All the humiliation he had suffered would be washed away at this moment. So what if you are powerful? You were just fighting with your life. Now that his strength had increased, what was his opponent's? If this was not a chance to win, what was? Do you think you are a match for me? Xiao Yang coldly snorted in disdain as he said, faced with such mockery, that disdainful tone and attitude, Bailey Zhen was on the verge of going crazy. Where did this guy get his confidence from? How could he look down on me like this? Forget it. Since you are so confident, I will beat you to death. I will let you know that there is a price to pay for boasting. With that thought in mind, Bailey Zhen no longer hesitated. Immediately, the Thunder Bear clenched its fists and charged toward Xiao Yang. The power of this punch was many times stronger than before. The power of this punch alone was enough to severely injure an ordinary cultivator from the martial emperor's realm. Even Xiao Yang could not help but frown. For a moment, he could not help but feel frightened. The punch was full of lightning, and the power was very violent. It was as if it was unstoppable. It was shocking. However, how could Xiao Yang give up so easily? He only felt that his knowledge had been shaken. Then he raised his sword again. It was as if he did not take his opponent seriously. As the sword soared into the sky, it was filled with boundless confidence. Bailey Zhen saw that the kid was charging at him with his sword. He could not help but feel confused. Could it be that he had not used his full strength? Or did he have something up his sleeve? Was that why he was so confident? This made Bailey Zhen have many doubts in his heart. He had to be very careful. He could not afford to make any more mistakes. After all, this was the decisive blow. How could he let anything go wrong? It was also because of the previous battle that Bailey Zhen had become much more cautious. Even though his heart was already burning with rage, he could not lose his mind. Every attack and defense needed to be carefully considered before he could make a decision. Otherwise, one mistake would give his opponent an opportunity to seize. The flames rose, and it looked as if half the sky had been burned red. The young man was like an arrow that had been released from a bow. He charged forward fearlessly. Boom! When the sword edge and the fist collided, an extremely loud sound was immediately produced. Crackling sounds could be said to be rising and falling one after another. It was a pure collision of strength between the two. Instantly, lightning and fire flashed. It was extremely dazzling. There were even ripples of power, and the distant southern paradise around them suffered a calamity as a result. Some mountains were destroyed, and some trees were set ablaze. As for the living beings who were so shocked that they couldn't move, they could only wait for death in this catastrophe. Bailey Zhen was even more shocked when he sensed the strength of that power. Even now, his opponent was still able to fight him on equal footing. The more Bailey Zhen thought about it, the angrier he became. Not only was his cultivation level higher, but he also had the support of the array. How could he lose to him? Bailey Zhen shouted angrily. Suddenly, the energy in his fist intensified. He threw out a punch. Xiao Yang was momentarily unable to control himself as a huge force assaulted him. He was instantly sent flying backwards, and it was difficult for him to continue fighting. Bailey Zhen was overjoyed when he saw that his angry punch had forced his opponent to retreat. He immediately controlled the giant brother Lei to chase after him. This was a great opportunity. How could he miss it? If he could kill his opponent with another punch, this battle would be over. Chapter 2232. The giant lightning bear was also extremely fast. With the speed of the other punch, it was about to reach Xiao Yang in the blink of an eye. With the support of the formation, Bailey Zhen was no longer as evenly matched with his opponent as before. Now that he had another weight on the scale, it would naturally tilt towards his side. Moreover, it was more than just a little. At this moment, Xiao Yang was complaining incessantly in his heart. He had to admit that he had underestimated the power of the formation. That was why he had suffered such a great loss. However, this was not enough to completely defeat him. After all, this was only the beginning and not the end. With that, he let out a low roar. Suddenly, an invisible barrier seemed to appear behind him, blocking him. He did not retreat at all. He was as immovable as a mountain. In an instant, Xiaoyang also drew his sword. Immediately, the power of lightning and fire surged out crazily. It was as if he had a card up his sleeve. Lightning strike, fire strike! At that moment, the two streams of sword qi converged together and unleashed an extremely powerful attack. Countless streams of sword qi continuously blasted out and slashed on the giant fist. The sound of explosions could be said to be one after another. With every stream of sword qi that fell, the lightning on the fist would be reduced by a little. This was the wearing down of power. It depended on who had more power to win this battle. However, although the fist's advance was slowed down, it did not stop. The divine sword in Xiaoyang's hand was also advancing. The power contained in the sword was also extremely terrifying. That fist was actually pierced through by the sword. Break! With a low roar, the fist immediately exploded. An extremely powerful shockwave began to surge out. Within a radius of 10 miles, it could be said that the people were plunged into misery and suffering. Moreover, this was under the condition that the world spirit was covering for it. Otherwise, the entire distant southern paradise might have suffered a great deal of damage because of this. In fact, there might even be more terrifying consequences. Suddenly, Bailey Zhen's confidence was defeated. In this contest of strength he actually lost? This became the question in his heart, and he found it hard to believe. At the very least, it was difficult for him to accept such an outcome. He couldn't understand why this would happen. However, he didn't have much time to think about it. After all, the current situation was the most important. As long as he could win this battle, he would have the opportunity and possibility to think. Otherwise, he could only retreat in defeat or even lose his life. That was something that was not impossible. Naturally, he was very clear about which was more important. Bailey Zhen didn't dare to continue fighting. He immediately retreated and returned to his original position. He stared at Xiaoyang like a tiger watching its prey. He was extremely cautious. Xiaoyang did not follow up with another attack. Instead, he stood with his sword in hand. The clothes on his body had become extremely tattered after being struck by the thunderbolts. Although he had a breath of spiritual energy to protect his body, there were still many burn marks on his arms. It was not difficult to figure out how terrifying the thunderbolts were. If it wasn't for Xiaoyang's proficiency in the way of body refinement, perhaps his arm would have been destroyed by that sword. It could be said that Xiaoyang was treading on thin ice in the current situation. If he wasn't careful, he would suffer a great loss. It could even lead to an irreversible situation. After Bailey Zhen retreated back to the formation, his left arm, which had been cut by Xiaoyang, began to recover rapidly under the surge of power. At this moment, Bailey Zhen's face had turned pale. He didn't expect that not only would he not be able to easily crush his opponent, but he would also almost suffer a great loss. This was really difficult for him to accept. Therefore, it was difficult for him to turn the situation around. Now, Bailey Zhen began to mutter in his heart. He didn't know what kind of person his opponent was and why his strength was so terrifying. At this point, the word shocking could no longer be used to describe the battle. In fact, he even felt a little hopeless and puzzled. Why was it like this? Things had changed a little too quickly, catching everyone off guard. The white bear warriors, who had been drained of their strength, turned pale. Although they had the support of the formation, it was still difficult to make up for such a huge gap. Soon after, they took pills one after another. Only then did they feel better and not find it difficult to continue. At this moment, Bailey Zhen also felt that it was difficult. He felt that he couldn't continue to be entangled. Otherwise, he would suffer even more losses. In fact, under such a situation, it might even lead to an even worse situation. Therefore, he had to end the battle as soon as possible. Moreover, he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. With that in mind, Bailey Zhen already had a plan in mind. Then he would bet all his strength to fight back. Only in this way would he have a chance to survive. Moreover, after experiencing such a long battle, Bailey Zhen also realized that deciding the outcome of the battle with one move was the wisest choice. He had been holding back all this while. So how could he possibly defeat this monstrous genius? Perhaps it was this kind of attack that gave the opponent enough time to retreat and wear him down to nothing. Now that he thought about it, Bailey Feng's defeat and death were probably the same as this. Soon after, Bailey Zhen's eyes were filled with determination, because, in his opinion, it was time to fight to the death. Instead of boiling a frog in warm water, it was better to end the battle quickly. Even if he lost and died, he would be decisive and not die because of his fear and indecisiveness. With that thought in mind, Bailey Zhen's heart was filled with determination. Soon after, one of Bailey Zhen's hands began to move. One by one he formed hand seals. Although Bailey Zhen had lost an arm, and this had indeed affected him somewhat, he was able to use his experience to make up for it. In an instant, Xiaoyang also felt the change in the atmosphere. An invisible pressure was constantly attacking him, causing him to feel a great sense of oppression. "Looks like you're really anxious," Xiaoyang thought to himself as the corners of his mouth curled up. Everything was going according to his plan. He was waiting for his opponent to make a mistake so that he could turn the situation around. Furious Thunder Dragon Roar. Chapter 2233. As Bailey Zhen continued to form hand seals, the energy around him began to change drastically. At this moment, the power of thunderbolts gathered together as well. Furthermore, the bolts of lightning continued to fuse together, forming an even more powerful attack. The aura in the surroundings had also become extremely restless due to the excessive amount of lightning elements. It was as if a small spark was all that was needed to ignite this place. The embryonic form of a lightning dragon slowly appeared. Xiaoyang first held his sword in preparation for the attack. Then he frowned and carried the divine sword on his back. Xiaoyang now looked calm and composed. It was as if he did not care about what was about to happen. It was as if he knew what was going to happen next. That was why he was so calm and did not look nervous at all. When Bailey Zhen saw that his opponent was not paying attention to his attack, he became even more furious. This brat seemed to have been putting on airs all this time, and even mocking him. This made him very angry. No matter how powerful he was, it was too much for him to look down on his opponent. Such an attitude could be said to be extremely vile. "All right, next, I'll make you pay the price. You'll pay the price for your arrogance." Bailey Zhen thought to himself. His hand movements became even faster. Now he had thought it through. Since his opponent looked down on him, he deserved to be severely injured. Of course, if his opponent was really careless, Bailey Zhen would feel that it was worth it to kill him. Bailey Zhen seemed to have forgotten his mission. The main reason was that Xiaoyang's attitude had made it difficult for him to control himself. This made him want to kill his opponent to prove himself. However, it was also because of such thoughts that he began to overlook some things. All he thought about was how to defeat his opponent. Kill! Bailey Zhen's attack was completed. He immediately roared and pushed one of his hands forward. Instantly, the lightning dragon was formed. With endless power, it roared and charged toward Xiaoyang. Everywhere it passed, the space was shattered. This attack was the ultimate skill of the White Bear clan. Even Bailey Zhen had to rely on the support of the formation to barely unleash the power of the attack. At the same time, Bailey Zhen was watching with rapt attention. He could not even take his eyes off Lin Huang. He wanted to see the brat be smashed into pieces and turned into ashes under the lightning dragon's attack. He did not even dare to blink his eyes. It was as if he was afraid that he would miss something interesting and regret it. As for that brat, he still had a lazy expression on his face. It was as if he simply did not care about this tyrannical attack at all. In fact, Xiaoyang even stretched his back, which made him look lazy. This made Bailey Zhen gnash his teeth in anger. He could not accept that Lin Huang's attack. How could he continue to put on a show? Then, Xiaoyang activated his mental cultivation method. He drew a circle in the void with one hand. He looked very relaxed and did not look like he was ready for battle. Because he had cultivated the first 2 scrolls, the feeling of discomfort from before had been completely erased. That was why he was so relaxed when he was doing all this. It could even be said that he did it effortlessly. As the space fluctuated slightly, Bailey Zhen's heart was filled with doubts. What kind of technique is this brat going to use to change all of this? Or could it be that he already had a plan to deal with it, and that was why he was so relaxed? Moreover, my attack is exactly what he wants. Is that why he is so happy? Question after question appeared in his mind. However, Bailey Zhen did not have time to think about it. This was because he would be able to see the result very soon. In the blink of an eye, the lightning dragon had arrived. As for Xiaoyang, he was finally done with his circle. The art of great transfer. As he shouted, the circle appeared. The space in the circle began to fluctuate and become mysterious. The lightning dragon with unparalleled might plunged into the circle. Then, Bailey Zhen's eyes were filled with shock. The reason for that was because what Bailey Zhen saw was that after the lightning dragon entered the strange circle, it disappeared without a trace. What was going on here? He could not figure it out and felt very helpless. However, in the next moment, Bailey Zhen's shock was broken. This was because he felt that there was a strong tremor in the space above his head. There was even a strong force that was ready to take action. Xiaoyang continued to watch with an indifferent expression. He looked relaxed, but he was actually using a lot of effort to control everything. After all, it was just an appearance. It was not easy to control the art of great transfer. No, impossible. When Bailey Zhen saw the circle above his head, his eyes were filled with disbelief. He could no longer remain calm because this was not the result he wanted. After the circle appeared, the lightning dragon that had disappeared mysteriously reappeared. It was an attack that belonged to Bailey Zhen. He did not expect it at all. He did not expect his own attack to appear at this moment. Moreover, the target of the attack was him. This made Bailey Zhen even more astonished, and he was even dumbfounded. Could it be that the attack was directed at him? Or was he attacking himself? No matter how one looked at it, this matter was simply outrageous. As his aura was completely locked, Bailey Zhen could not escape at all. All he could do was to fight with all his might. Perhaps if he gave it his all, he might be able to block the power of the attack. Otherwise, the consequences would be unimaginable. Bailey Zhen did not dare to hesitate. He immediately mobilized his subordinates' forces. He couldn't care less about the consequences of his actions. Right now, the most important thing was to protect his own life. The giant lightning bear also started to move. It raised its claws as if it was holding up the sky. At this moment, an immense amount of power was unleashed. Bolts of lightning spread out as if it was trying to weave a giant net to protect him from any attacks. However, the dragon head had already arrived. The net collapsed upon contact. It was impossible to resist. Chapter 2234. Bailey Zhen was well aware of how terrifying the power of this move was. The lightning net had already been broken, so he could only use the lightning bear to resist it. This was also where the ingenuity of the formation lay. The huge entity formed was like a huge protective umbrella for them. However, under the attack of the lightning dragon, the huge lightning bear was forced to retreat. It could not withstand the attack at all. This was his full strength attack, so the power contained within was naturally terrifying. The huge lightning bear kept retreating, and its limbs began to disappear. That was a sign of exhaustion. Bailey Zhen was complaining incessantly in his heart. He was constantly replenishing his energy, but it was difficult to make up for the huge gap in a short period of time. He could only watch helplessly as his opponent retreated. If this continued, only death would await him, Bailey Zhen thought. At the same time, a strong desire to live erupted. He no longer cared about his cultivation level and began to release his power wildly. As long as he could block it, everything would be fine. As long as he could keep his life, there would be a future. But if he died here, everything would be over. How could they accept such an outcome? As a result, the change in his mentality made him want to live even more desperately. The two forces that belonged to the same person were crazily clashing. Boom! The huge lightning bear could no longer sustain itself and instantly shattered. Because of that, the spirit formation was directly destroyed. Immediately, the backlash caused the crowd to move back. The white bear warriors below fell to the ground and fainted because their cultivation levels were lower and they had lost too much energy. In fact, some of the weaker ones even lost their lives. The lightning dragon had penetrated Bailey Zhen's body. Bailey Zhen looked at the hole in his chest, which was still faintly flickering with lightning. His face turned extremely ugly. He had never thought that there would be a day when he would be defeated by his own hands. What was going on? Would anyone believe him if he told them? Even Bailey Zhen himself did not expect that the move that was filled with murderous intent to decide the outcome of the battle would end up killing him in the end. He was afraid that the young man had already thought of this step and was waiting for this move to kill him, to make him lose his life in his own hands. The more he thought about it, the more bitter Bailey Zhen felt. A sense of self-mockery and helplessness rose in Bailey Zhen's heart at this moment. He had roamed unhindered in the middle world for so many years, and he had encountered opponents stronger than himself. But he had never imagined that he would be defeated by a junior. Moreover, his cultivation level was lower than his. If this kind of thing were to be spread out, he would probably be laughed at by his comrades. Even now, he still found it hard to accept such a situation. Why was he defeated? Furthermore, it was so thorough. Could it really be because of that small variable? Was that really the case? Or was it because his skills were not as good as his opponents, resulting in today's calamity that was difficult to escape? Bailey Zhen was unable to come up with an answer to the many questions he had. There were too many things that he was unwilling to accept, and he was unwilling to accept such a cruel reality. However, Bailey Zhen's vision started to darken. It was as if death was close at hand. All the hard work in his life had come to an end, and there was no turning back. All the unwillingness in his heart could only be turned into reality, but it was difficult to accept. At this moment, Xiaoyang also charged forward with a sword. As far as he was concerned, it was the best choice to kill his opponent now. Although his opponent's strength had been greatly affected, and his life was hanging by a thread. However, he was still alive. Facing such an enemy, Xiaoyang would not be lenient at all. Only by killing him could he put an end to future troubles. When Bailey Zhen saw Xiaoyang's overbearing manner, and that he was not prepared to give him a way out, he was instantly shocked and furious. In the blink of an eye, Bailey Zhen forced himself to take a deep breath. He gathered all the strength in his body and struck out with his palm. Immediately, thunderbolts surged out one after another. They were like spiritual snakes as they flowed out continuously. Their might was unparalleled. This was a strike filled with anger, but it was also a strike for survival. At this moment, many martial skills could be said to be integrated. The power of this strike was unparalleled. Even someone as powerful as Xiaoyang had to immediately use the teleportation skill to neutralize all the attacks. Bailey Zhen was still standing there, and his face was full of determination. "Come on. Didn't you want to kill me? Why? Are you afraid now?" Bailey Zhen said disdainfully, and the corners of his mouth curled up slightly. The current Bailey Zhen had also begun to deliberately mystify things. This was because he knew that the weaker he appeared, the faster he would die. If he made his opponent fearful, he might still have a chance to live. What could be more important than his own survival? Therefore, Bailey Zhen was very clear-headed and knew what he was doing. The anger from before had been swept away, and what was left was endless calmness. He knew very well what he had to do now to fight for a chance to survive. What's the point of holding on? It's just more pain, Xiaoyang said calmly. Now, Xiaoyang was indeed somewhat afraid of Beilizhen. As a martial emperor, if he really wanted to fight to the death, he would naturally have some tricks up his sleeve. Therefore, he had to be on his guard. At least, Xiaoyang was now the only pillar of support for the drifting cloud boundary. He could not let anything happen to him. Therefore, he had to respect himself and avoid unnecessary risks. Beilizhen laughed. He thought this was hilarious. What was the point? If he could live, then there was a point. If he couldn't live, then there was no point. Therefore, this was the reason why he continued to persevere. I have to admit that you are the most outstanding human cultivator I have ever seen. To you, challenging those of a higher cultivation level is a common occurrence. I didn't expect you to be able to do it in the martial emperor realm, Beilizhen said, and the corners of his mouth turned bitter. In the beginning, he thought he had gotten a good job and could easily lie on the merit book and reap the benefits. However, who would have thought that the end result would be like this? He was about to lose his life because of this. In the future, he would be ashamed in the tribe. Chapter 2235. Although Beilizhen was unwilling, he could do nothing about it. He knew very well that Xiaoyang would not let him leave this place alive. If he wanted to protect himself, it would be a big problem. As for what would happen in the future, how could he care so much? He had never thought that he would be tricked here. The feeling of being on a good mission was gradually fading away. What was left was endless bitterness. Until now, he still couldn't figure out why he had been defeated so carelessly. No matter how he thought about it, it did not make sense. Do you really think you can kill me? Beilizhen's face suddenly changed and he laughed. He was a martial royal realm expert with a cultivation of rank 3. This strength was enough to look down on the entire drifting cloud boundary. If you fought with your life before this, I might be afraid of you. But now, your qi has completely dissipated. What's there to be afraid of? Xiaoyang said coldly with a slight smile. Xiaoyang had waited for Beilizhen's qi to dissipate. If Beilizhen didn't care about his own life, Xiaoyang would have been able to survive. However, the distant southern paradise would have been destroyed in an instant. Xiaoyang was still very clear about which was more important. However, he did not expect Beilizhen to be depressed for a while and miss such a great opportunity. This was human nature. Who would be willing to die? Being able to live was the goal of many cultivators. What was the purpose of cultivation? Of course, it was to be strong and to live forever. Beilizhen could not help but fall into despair when he saw through all of this. He did not expect this young man to have so many thoughts. He had grasped every key point just right. Suddenly, Beilizhen realized that a small world must have gone through a lot of difficulties to be able to rise to this level. Naturally, it was impossible for him to be an ordinary person. In the end, it was because he had underestimated his opponent that he had planted such a bad fruit. He could only swallow it himself. Xiaoyang slowly walked over. Every step was heavy and cautious. This was because he wasn't sure if Beilizhen still had any other tricks up his sleeve. If he wasn't careful, he might just plant a seed of disaster for himself. This was a risk that they absolutely could not take. Otherwise, it would be too late for regrets in the future. Even though the other party's life was hanging by a thread, he could not relax at all. Even if he was extremely confident, he still couldn't be careless. Do you think that you'll win if you kill me? Beilizhen suddenly burst into laughter. His laughter was completely out of tune with the current situation. When Xiaoyang heard this, his eyebrows furrowed slightly. Soon after, he let out a cold laugh. I know that you came prepared this time. Since someone has gone to the Sword Heart world, I'm afraid you're just a vanguard. You're here to hold me back so that your companions can invade other places. Am I right? Xiaoyang's lips curled up slightly as he said coldly. Beilizhen's expression changed again. Soon after, his expression returned to normal. Now that he thought about it, Xiaoyang had been ruthless from the beginning. He wanted to end the battle quickly because he had already guessed their thoughts. That was why he took such a risk. These people really couldn't be underestimated. No wonder they could make the White Bear clan suffer losses. They were really not simple. But you're also quite pitiful. Speaking of which, when I appeared here, your companions should have invaded and made it difficult for me to take care of them. However, until now, I haven't noticed any traces of them. I'm afraid they deliberately want you to die here. Xiao Yang said coldly. Hearing this, Bailey Zhen couldn't help but frown. He didn't know if Xiao Yang was telling the truth, but judging from the fact that he was still talking nonsense with him, it was indeed true. If his companions had already made their move, then, as the flowing cloud realm's only powerful master, they naturally wouldn't waste time here with him. They would probably have taken his life long ago to defend and put out the fire. For a moment, Bailey Zhen couldn't help but feel sad. He didn't expect that he would end up like this. He didn't expect that he would be betrayed by his own people. In the sky above the drifting cloud world, a group of people gathered. A man in white robes with a face as gentle as jade held a folding fan in his hand, appearing to be very leisurely. He looked down at the small world in front of him, and the smile at the corner of his mouth couldn't help but become wider. There was also a hint of playfulness in his eyes. I didn't expect that this seemingly barren, small world actually has a world spiritual vein. This is really a rare thing. No wonder it could give birth to an outstanding talent. The man in white joked. The people behind him all revealed greedy eyes. Although the spiritual vein of the world was still very weak, if they could obtain it, their strength would be greatly improved. This made everyone extremely excited. They also firmly believed that they would gain a lot from this battle. In fact, it was beyond their original expectations. Mr. Bai, we've been waiting here for a long time. If we continue to delay, I'm afraid we'll make a mistake. A rough-looking man walked out and said in a muffled voice. The man in white nodded with a smile and said, "What's the hurry? Since that person has the strength, we'll wait a little longer. When he's almost exhausted, we can then advance. Otherwise, do you think this is a fight? This is war." The rough-looking man lowered his head. Although he had a lot of resentment in his heart, he didn't dare to show it. After all, he was the leader this time. The man in white saw that the morale of these people had reached its peak, so he ordered, "Since you're so anxious, you take people to occupy Spring Sun City first." When the man heard this, he was instantly overjoyed and said, "Yes, sir." Then the man led a small half of his men and quickly charged towards the drifting cloud world. If they could quickly occupy a strategic location and choke the opponent's throat, it would be a great achievement. The man in white waited for a while and said, "Let's go too." After he finished speaking, the soldiers behind him also began to cheer. To them, this was the order they were waiting for. There were even some people who were so excited that they started shouting. There were even some people who were unable to suppress their true appearance. Chapter 2236. Suddenly, Xiao Yang felt countless powerful auras entering the drifting cloud realm. There were so many of them that they could not be underestimated. At this time, Bailey Zhen also noticed this detail. He laughed and said, "Ha, you look so pale. They must have arrived." As he spoke, Bailey Zhen's smile became even more rampant. He knew that he could not leave this place alive today, but it seemed good to drag more people down with him. Although it seemed like a loss, this world would probably be destroyed in the future. "You're right," Xiao Yang said indifferently. As soon as he finished speaking, he rushed in front of Bailey Zhen in an instant. The Thunderfire Divine sword in his hand stabbed into Bailey Zhen's chest. Immediately, countless sword intents poured out, killing all of Bailey Zhen's vitality. Bailey Zhen's expression froze at this moment. The intense pain made his face contort, and he kept rolling on the ground. Then, Xiao Yang pulled out the divine sword and waved it, killing the rest of the White Bear warriors. Although the rank 9 White Bears of King Wu could not affect the progress of the battle, killing them could reduce the losses. Then, Xiao Yang immediately made a gesture to summon Xiaohua. After swallowing him, Come and support me immediately." Xiaoyang said. Xiao Hua nodded immediately and swallowed Bailey Zhen's body in one gulp. To Xiao Hua, a martial emperor expert, was simply a great tonic. Xiaoyang immediately turned around and went to the western line of defense. He didn't know what would happen next, but he had to rush over as soon as possible. At the same time, the battles were also going on in various places. On the Sword Heart World side, the killing was also unceasing. As the purple-robed man joined the battle with thousands of troops, the balance of victory and defeat changed greatly again. Previously, Bai Jian could still move freely, but now he was besieged by 4 experts of the same realm. It was difficult for him to break through the encirclement. In fact, there were even many wounds on his body. It could be said that he was seriously injured. However, he did not care about his injuries at all. He knew that he could not soften his tone. Otherwise, the final outcome would be very terrible. He also had to stand and kill the enemy. Otherwise, his fellow sect members would all die here. Now, because the top fighting forces were fighting, the only one who could take care of the battlefield was Bai Jian. There was indeed an elder in the martial royal realm. However, under the siege, he could only kill 2 of them before he died. This battle could be said to be exceptionally tragic and cruel. Countless disciples had lost their lives here. The boundless grassland was also dyed red with blood. There were severed limbs everywhere, and pieces of flesh flew everywhere. In the eyes of the people of the myriad beast realm, the Sword Heart World was just a trapped beast struggling. Furthermore, they would not be able to maintain their current state for long. It was only a matter of time before they were defeated. But what was the point of their persistence? The warriors of the myriad beast realm did not think about it. Because of the stimulation of fresh blood, their bestial nature became even more violent. Suddenly, 2 more martial royal realm experts joined in. Bai Jian could be said to be surrounded. Under such circumstances, it was even more difficult for 2 fists to fight against 4 legs. It was true that Bai Jian's sword moves were swift and fierce. Every time he attacked, it was a killing move. However, because there were too many opponents, he was already finding it difficult to continue. At least in the current situation, he was about to be unable to hold on. In a trance, Bai Jian saw 2 rays of golden light sprinkling down. He saw 2 martial royal realm experts, nailed to the ground and lost their lives in an instant. He looked up and found that while Princess Mingzhu was fighting the purple-robed man, she was still able to free up her hands to help him get rid of the 2 troubles. As a result, Bai Jian smiled bitterly. The existence of the top of the younger generation was indeed not simple. She killed 2 martial royal realm experts in a single move. It could be said that she was extremely powerful. Do you really think that I, Bai Jian, am a pushover that can be bullied at will? Go to hell. As Bai Jian spoke, he held the sword in his hand horizontally in front of his chest. As soon as he finished speaking, countless flying swords appeared on his body. The last time he attacked like this, it was against Tian Bunu. At this moment, his heart of the sword was brightly lit. Countless sharp auras burst out continuously. Each and every one of the flying swords contained boundless sword intent. In an instant, the sword light shone brightly and soared into the sky. With Bai Jian as the center, 3,000 flying swords formed a sword circle and danced around his body. When they saw this scene, the martial royal realm experts surrounding Bai Jian were all shocked. They did not expect such an unforeseen event to happen in a battle formation. As for the cultivators of the heart of the sword realm, their morale was greatly boosted. Their hearts were filled with hope. Princess Mingzhu glanced at them and immediately continued to focus on dealing with the purple-robed man. Now, killing him was her top priority. Although she did not know what was going on in the flowing cloud realm, Princess Mingzhu had to escape as soon as possible to avoid any major accidents. How could Princess Mingzhu not be aware of all these things? However, perhaps it was because she was too impatient, but she was unable to win this match. When Li Fengmu, who was high in the sky, sensed the sword qi, he laughed loudly. His smile was very gratified. Bai Jian, you can actually make a breakthrough in battle. It seems that you still need to fight more to be able to comprehend the true essence of the way of the sword. Well, with you here, I have nothing to worry about. After Li Fengmu finished speaking, his sword moves became even fiercer. All along, Li Fengmu had been worried because he did not have an inheritance. The person he valued had always been Bai Jian. It was a pity that his lazy personality made people feel that he could not bear the heavy responsibility. As for his junior, Li Chuanyi, although he was not bad, compared to Bai Jian, he was lackluster. Die! Bai Jian suddenly roared. 3,000 flying swords slashed out and shot towards several martial royal realm experts. In the face of such a powerful attack, the martial royal realm experts could not help but panic. However, it was only for a moment. When they came back to their senses and were on guard, the flying swords had already penetrated their bodies. After the flying swords passed through their bodies, they did not stop. They continued to fly and kill the rest. It seemed that Bai Jian wanted to kill everyone in one move. Chapter 2237. Xiao Yang received the news from Li Chuanyi as soon as he stepped out of the distant southern grotto heaven. When he found out about this, he felt a little helpless in his heart. The situation in the Sword Heart realm was not good either. Princess Mingzhu would not be able to return for the time being. Therefore, it was impossible for them to defend against the attack this time. Moreover, the enemy's attack this time was mainly aimed at West Wind City and Spring Sun City. As for the other lines of defense, there would probably be people attacking them as well. It could be said that the enemy's attack was completely aimed at the western line of defense. The enemy's attitude was very clear. They would start from the west and gradually nibble away at the drifting cloud realm until they completely devoured it. Immediately, Xiao Yang made a prompt decision and ordered everyone to retreat immediately. The most important thing now was how to preserve their strength. As for some of the territories, so be it if they lost them, there was nothing they could do about it. If Princess Mingzhu was here, she would naturally be able to fight back. However, Xiao Yang was only one person now. It was almost impossible for him to defend the entire line. Although the two cities were supported by formations, it was still insufficient in the face of absolute strength. In West Wind City, Ji Fei suddenly felt an immense pressure coming at them. He activated the formation immediately and ordered everyone to prepare for battle. However, at this moment, Ji Fei suddenly received a message. It was the sect leader who ordered him to lead everyone to retreat. They were retreating before the battle had even begun? This made Ji Fei feel uncomfortable in his heart. What was going on? What did he say? Next to him, Unrivaled God asked. At the beginning, Unrivaled God and Chu Nanfeng had gone their separate ways to provide support and had been stationed there for a long time. Sect leader Xiao ordered us to retreat to Summit Victory Mountain immediately. We can't hesitate, Ji Fei said helplessly. Unrivaled God's expression changed drastically when he heard this. He immediately shouted, "Everyone, retreat to Summit Victory Mountain immediately. There must be no delay." Everyone could not help but be stunned when they heard this order. However, following Unrivaled God's continuous orders, the warriors from the two worlds began to move quickly. They did not even have time to pack their things before they retreated immediately. Ji Fei slammed his palm on the city wall. He was very unwilling. It was not that he didn't know the seriousness of the matter and how important it was to preserve his strength, but to hand over the well-managed West Wind City to someone else, he felt somewhat aggrieved. The first line of defense that he had painstakingly built was gone just like that. He felt extremely displeased. If that was the case, it would be better to use Summit Victory as the first line of defense. How could there be so many things to do? I'm afraid that Xiao Yang won't be able to provide support, which is why he told us to evacuate as soon as possible. Don't overthink it. We've all witnessed how terrifying the White Bear tribe's abilities are. If Xiao Yang isn't here, how are we going to fight them? Unrivaled God immediately consoled her. Hearing such comforting words, Ji Fei's mood became better and he was no longer as depressed. It could be said that they had retreated to preserve their strength for the next counterattack. Otherwise, Xiaoyang would not be able to fight back on his own in the future if all his elites were lost here. Go and activate the formation and use it to cover our retreat. Don't get caught up in the battle. I'll go to Spring Sun City to pick up the old Prime Minister right away so that he won't lose his temper and cause unnecessary losses, Unrivaled God said. Hearing this, Ji Fei immediately got to work. Although the activation of these formations could not completely stop the enemy's advance, it could stop them from advancing for a while. However, the time bot would allow Xiaoyang to arrive in time. It was even possible that they could turn the tide of the battle. Therefore, they were well aware of how they should deal with this matter. In Spring Sun City, the old Prime Minister appeared hesitant after receiving the order. Xiaoyang wants us to retreat immediately and abandon Spring Sun City, the old Prime Minister sighed and said. Chu Nanfeng snorted coldly when he heard this. The battle has only just begun and we're already retreating? Isn't he afraid that our morale will drop to rock bottom if he does that? When Chu Nanfeng was in the 3,000 small worlds, he had led troops to many places. All this while it was only others who fled at the sight of his name. There was no reason for Chu Nanfeng to flee before he even saw the enemy. Therefore, Chu Nanfeng was very unhappy about this. He felt that such a decision was a little too childish. The old Prime Minister frowned when he heard this. He was still rather displeased. Yes, the divine realm had always dominated the world. There was no reason for them to be afraid of war. However, now that Princess Mingzhu was not around, Xiaoyang was the one who made the decision. His right to speak was also unquestionable. However, they dared not slack off because they were unwilling to give up. Master Zhao's thinking is very simple. He's just trying to preserve his strength. All of this is understandable, the old Prime Minister said with a smile. Although such a method was indeed very wise at the moment, it was indeed very wise. However, it was very unprincipled. Retreating before the battle had even begun? Was it not a little too cowardly? Was it really appropriate to do this? At least, in the hearts of the master and disciple, it was not appropriate. Even if they were to retreat, they should retreat as they fought. Otherwise, if they left directly, it would be too damaging to their morale. Although that's the case if a person does not even have the slightest intention of resisting, how can he talk about the future? It seems that the people of the drifting cloud realm are really timid. They don't even dare to accept such a small matter, Chu Nanfeng said with some disdain. The old Prime Minister also smiled. He agreed with this view. This was also caused by the inherent pride of the people of the divine realm. They did not care so much. What they thought more about was glory and pride. If a person did not even have the slightest intention of fighting, how could he talk about the future? He might as well just surrender. Moreover, during this period of time, they had spent a lot of effort on the first line of defense. Wouldn't it be nonsense to give up so much effort just like that? If they did not test the deployment of the line of defense during the battle and left so casually, they might have to retreat to the divine capital in the end. In that case, the final outcome might be to raise their hands and surrender. They would never be able to fight again. Chapter 2238. On the city wall of West Wind City, after the man in white personally broke the formation, he found that this place had become an empty city. He felt a little puzzled. A group of generals followed behind, their eyes full of puzzlement. They really did not understand why the defensive line that they had spent so much effort to build was empty. Some people even went to investigate and found that there were traces of life here. In other words, there were people stationed here before. Moreover, according to the information they obtained, this was an important city of the defensive line, but there was no one stationed here. Why was that? Could it be that this place was just a deceptive formation? It seems that those guys fled at the sight of our arrival. Knowing that our tribe is here, they ran away in fear. A general laughed. Of course, this was only his personal speculation, but as for the specific facts, he still had no idea. The man in white shook his head. He felt that this matter was not that simple. Perhaps they had met their match this time. This West Wind City had suffered an incomparably strong resistance last time, and they had even succeeded in defending it. However, this time they did not see a single person. This matter was a little strange. Soon after, the white-clothed man slowly closed his eyes and began to sense the surroundings. He wanted to see what exactly was going on. Everything was illogical. If he could not find any clues, he was afraid that he would suffer a lot if he rashly moved forward. Seeing that the man in white did not say anything, the generals all restrained their emotions and did not dare to say anything, for fear of disturbing his train of thought. At the same time, the White Bear warriors also began to search the city, lest they missed anything. If they missed anything, once a disaster was planted, who knew how many brothers would suffer because of it? Therefore, they did not dare to miss anything. Everyone was very careful, for fear of missing any detail. A long while later, the white-clothed man slowly opened his eyes and said, "They all left in the time it takes to brew a cup of tea." As soon as these words came out, everyone present could not help but be taken aback, because from these words, they also felt that something was different. That is, they did not feel any surveillance, so how did the opponent know of their whereabouts? Could it be that the opponent had the ability to predict the future, so he was able to retreat in time? This was also where the white-clothed man's doubts lay. All of this seemed too strange, so much so that he could not figure out what was going on. However, according to his understanding, this matter was not as simple as he thought it was. Perhaps this time he had really met his match, and it was a very difficult one to deal with. Now, they would have to be very careful with every step they took. Otherwise, one wrong step and they would be defeated. Interesting, interesting. The man in white suddenly laughed. He had never thought that he would meet an opponent in Flowing Cloud World, where he had ascended from a small world. This was something to look forward to. Hearing these words, everyone's faces turned ugly. From what they could see, Mr. White's opponent was no ordinary person. Who knows, he might even be a very strong opponent. Thinking about it this way, Bailey Feng's previous defeat to Shin Chong was most likely not a coincidence. Perhaps it was because there were too many tricks involved which led to his failure. With West Wind City as the base, the army will be stationed here. With this as a stronghold, we will nibble away at Flowing Cloud World. The white-clothed man ordered. Hearing this, everyone immediately went to work. Although on paper, their strength seemed to be able to crush this small world. Was it really that simple? At least, from what they could see, it was not the case. After all, the lesson from before was deep enough. They could not afford to make any mistakes at every step. Moreover, obtaining the Flowing Cloud Realm was only the beginning. Their main focus was to swallow the God World. Only after taking down the God World could they be considered to have won this invasion war. Now, it was already so difficult to deal with a small Flowing Cloud World. If they were to face the strongest God World, who knew what kind of mistakes would happen? Therefore, with West Wind City as the beginning, they would nibble away at Flowing Cloud World step by step, and then take down the God World. That was the safest way. Moreover, the army that came this time was already the majority of the battle power that the White Bear clan could mobilize. If the losses were severe, this matter would become much more difficult. At that time, it would be wishful thinking for the White Bear clan to monopolize this battle credit. It would be impossible for them to do so. Third brother, you will be the vanguard and immediately chase after the retreating army. Remember, if the situation is not good, immediately retreat. Do not be greedy. The white-clothed man said. One person stepped out of the ranks, nodded, and waved his hand, leading his own troops to chase forward quickly. Immediately, the white-clothed man began to think. The first step was to take down West Wind City very easily. Then, what to do next became a problem that he needed to think about. The power that the White Bear clan could bring out now was very limited. Therefore, they could not attack rashly. although it could be easily done with the 1,000-beast realm. However, it would be impossible for him to take all the credit for himself. Xiaoyang also immediately went to summit Victory Mountain. In his opinion, this was also the most urgent matter. That was the real pass. As long as they defended Summit Victory Mountain, even if they entered Flowing Cloud World from other places, they would be attacked from both front and back. It was also because of this that Xiaoyang abandoned West Wind City and Spring Sun City, which had a long line of defense, and used Summit Victory Mountain as the base to fight against the enemy. Moreover, the formations set up in Summit Victory Mountain were much more powerful than those in the previous two cities. When he sensed that Ji Fei had retreated with all his men and even personally activated the formations to cover the retreat, he was very satisfied. It could be said that this method would expose and destroy all the formations on this front line. However, it could allow everyone to retreat unscathed. It was a profit. Otherwise, when the pursuers arrived, they would probably be utterly defeated. Suddenly, Xiaoyang frowned, because he noticed that the army in Spring Sun City had not completely retreated, and the old Prime Minister and Chu Nanfeng had not left yet. Chapter 2239. In Spring Sun City, the old Prime Minister's lips curled up slightly when he saw the army approaching. He had ordered most of the soldiers to retreat and left a portion behind. No matter what, he still had to try his luck. Moreover, this was a great opportunity to understand the strength of the opponent. How could he miss it? Moreover, if he missed this great opportunity, he would still be clueless about the strength of the enemy in the future. That was the scariest thing. What kind of logic would it be to collapse before the battle? Chu Nanfeng also became agitated because of this decision. He had always wanted to start the battle. Moreover, this thought was very urgent. If it was possible, he naturally wanted to kill and return the favor. If it wasn't for Xiaoyang's order, his soldiers wouldn't have evacuated so many of them. They naturally knew how terrifying the enemy's strength was. However, they still had to gamble. They couldn't afford to lose their courage. Fleeing before the battle wasn't their habit. If they could obtain victory now, that would be the most important thing. As for other things, they couldn't care less. As for what would happen next, they would only know after the battle. They're here. Chu Nanfeng suddenly frowned. At the same time, he took out a long spear, and an armor instantly covered his body. The old Prime Minister leaped into the air and landed at the center of the formation. At this moment, the array was suddenly activated, and an endless amount of energy gathered on his body. The old Prime Minister's essence, qi, and spirit were greatly shaken, and his aura became even more powerful, almost reaching the second-order martial emperor realm. Soon, the army of the White Bear tribe arrived. When the burly man in the lead saw the array, he revealed a disdainful smile. "You're just a first-level martial emperor. You want to block our path with the power of this array? That's wishful thinking." The coarse man laughed disdainfully. In his opinion, this method was like a mantis trying to stop a chariot. They were overestimating their own strength. The group of warriors also stopped in their tracks. They looked at the city below, and their eyes were burning with the flames of war. They were also very eager to start a war, to start a massacre. "Then let me see how much weight you have." The rough man shouted angrily and immediately punched out. When the Prime Minister saw this, he immediately threw out a punch. His attitude was very clear. He wanted to fight with the Prime Minister to see who was stronger. Chu Nanfeng, who was standing on top of the city wall, was ready to go. The God Realm warriors in the city were even more eager. It had been a long time since they had experienced a war. If one wanted to gain merit points, it could be said that it was the easiest way to gain merit points from battles. In the Divine Realm, if one wanted to hold a high position without sufficient strength, it was also possible as long as one had sufficient contributions. Each and every one of them could be said to be hot-blooded. Boom! As their fists collided, the old Prime Minister's body fell like a meteor, crashing into Spring Sun City. After seeing this scene, the morale of the Divine World's army became incomparably low. This was just the beginning of the fight, and he was already beaten to the point where he couldn't even fight back. How was he going to continue fighting? This was also the question in everyone's mind. They couldn't understand why this happened. The rough man stood on top of the city wall, his mouth full of disdain. He said, "You dare to fight with me with such little strength?" When Chu Nanfeng heard this, he was instantly unable to restrain his anger. His battle intent exploded. He was eager to fight and was ready to kill. "Nanfeng, hurry up and leave with your men. I will cover you." The old prime minister immediately stood up and shouted. However, when he opened his mouth, a large mouthful of blood flowed out continuously. In the fight just now, although the old prime minister had the support of the formation, his opponent was a third-level martial emperor. This was not a problem that could be solved by a formation. Therefore, he understood what to do next. Now, the old prime minister finally understood Xiaoyang's painstaking efforts. No wonder he asked him to bring his men and leave quickly. It was probably because of this reason. The other party had an expert who could crush them. Such a powerful person naturally couldn't fight. Once the battle started, they would be completely crushed in the end. They wouldn't be able to fight back at all. When Chu Nanfeng heard this, he couldn't help but hesitate again. This was because his thoughts had also changed a little. "Why aren't you leaving? What are you thinking about? Let's all go to taste Victory Mountain. Nanfeng, you bring up the rear and activate the formation. You must let the great men of the realm of the gods return alive." The old prime minister urged again. At the same time, the old prime minister rose from the ground again. The formation hadn't been broken yet, so he could still hold on for a while. However, this wouldn't last for long. However, the old prime minister was already prepared to buy more time for everyone to leave. Chu Nanfeng didn't hesitate anymore. He immediately ordered everyone to follow him and leave without delay. Instantly, countless people retreated rapidly. "You want to leave?" When the rough man saw this, he snorted and punched out again. If the old prime minister couldn't retreat, he wouldn't have the chance to return. Therefore, all he could do was rely on the power of the formation to continue holding on. However, with this punch, the old prime minister's body fell once again. The attack didn't end because of this. The rough man's goal wasn't just to occupy Spring Sun City. At the same time, they also needed to annihilate the remaining forces of the enemy. As long as their elite troops were completely annihilated, the enemy naturally wouldn't have the ability to resist. At that time, they could easily take over the drifting cloud world and force their way into the realm of the gods. Then, they could achieve the hegemony of the White Bear tribe. Although the old prime minister was severely injured and his entire body was trembling, he still relied on the power of the formation to continue charging forward. Now, the old prime minister completely understood that his bad habit of taking advantage of his seniority had cost him his life in the end. Because of this, the only thing he could do was to try his best to stop the enemy. This was the only way he could make up for his mistake. The old man didn't seem to know pain. He kept charging forward even though he was beaten to a pulp every time. Chu Nanfeng didn't dare to look back, but there were already 2 streams of tears in his eyes. Chapter 2240. The old prime minister was lying on the ground, bleeding from all his orifices. His body was so weak from the beating that he did not even have the strength to stand up. Even his consciousness was in a daze at this moment, as if he could pass away at any time. Scenes from the past kept replaying in the old prime minister's mind. He had completely fallen into despair. He had never thought that he would end up like this. Moreover, it was because of his arrogance and disobedience that led to this outcome. If he had listened to Xiaoyang's order and retreated earlier, the 2 armies might have met at Mount Triumph. He might have been able to hold on. However, he was now in a situation where he was isolated and helpless. In the end, he could only swallow this bitter fruit unwillingly. He had also heard that some people had bypassed Spring Sun City and were hunting down the warriors who had just retreated. The coarse man commanded everything in an orderly manner. From the beginning, they had used West Wind City and Spring Sun City as their base to invade the Four Realms Alliance. As for whether they would succeed in the Sword Heart Realm, winning would only be icing on the cake. Even if they lost, it would not matter. As long as the White Bear tribe could advance steadily and take down the Divine Realm, the Four Realms Alliance would most likely collapse in the shortest time possible. By then, it would be a piece of cake for them to completely take over the Four Realms Alliance. As for the remaining formations in Spring Sun City, he did not break them himself. Instead, he handed them over to his subordinates. After all, the other party had been completely defeated. As the main commander, he naturally only needed to watch. Of course, there were more things he needed to consider. Soon after, the coarse man looked towards the south. He wasn't sure what kind of situation his comrade was in. He did not know how long he could hold on. At the same time, Unrivaled God arrived as well. However, he concealed his aura. He was very displeased when he realized that the defeated army was being hunted down. He knew that he was late. The old Prime Minister did not listen to Xiao Yang's order and chose to fight. Fortunately, judging from the scale of the defeated army, they would not be severely injured. However, he couldn't sense any trace of the Prime Minister, and his heart sank. There weren't many people in the enemy's pursuit, which meant that the old Prime Minister was probably still fighting to buy enough time for the God Realm's army. Under such circumstances, the old Prime Minister wouldn't be able to hold on for long, even with the support of the formation. Unrivaled God's mood sank as he thought about this. Unexpectedly, the worst-case scenario still happened. After some hesitation, Unrivaled God had no choice but to sneak around. No matter what, he had to try and see if he could save the old Prime Minister. After all, to the Four Realms Alliance, every martial royal realm expert was extremely precious. Once it was lost, it might be irreparable. Unrivaled God had been stationed in the Drifting Cloud Realm for a very long time. Not only that, he had also set up formations on the battlefront with Xiaoyang. Therefore, he was very familiar with the surrounding environment and knew how to avoid these people's attention. When he arrived outside the city, Unrivaled God saw that Spring Sun City had been completely occupied. Even the flag had been changed. As for the old Prime Minister's aura, there wasn't even the slightest bit left. This made Unrivaled God feel a little hopeless. It seemed that the battle here had ended long ago, and the old Prime Minister had probably met with a mishap in the end. In the end, Unrivaled God could only shake his head and sigh helplessly. This must be the consequence of disobeying orders. If he had left Spring Sun City earlier, he wouldn't have ended up like this. When it came to battle formations, the slightest bit of hesitation could lead to eternal damnation. It was even possible that he might have delayed an even greater military mission because of this. At the end of the day, it was because he was too arrogant. He always thought that he was invincible and that he didn't have to listen to the orders of the master of a mini-world. Perhaps they had even mocked Xiaoyang, thinking that his actions were just a woman's view. In Spring Sun City, the rough-looking man had already come up with a plan. "Brother, take half of your men and go after them immediately. If Mr. Bai's men haven't arrived by the time you reach Summit Victory Mountain, stop. Don't act rashly. Kill as many as you can before you reach Summit Victory Mountain," the rough-looking man ordered. Since Spring Sun City had not suffered a very strong attack, it meant that the other place might not be able to resist the army either. Before this, they had already agreed to split into 2 groups to take down these 2 strategic towns and then attack Taste Victory Mountain. As long as they could cross Summit Victory Mountain, the defense line on the west of the Drifting Cloud Realm would be completely broken. As for the other places, they would not be as important as these 3 and would be easier to take down. A tall and sturdy man immediately received the order and led half of his men to chase after them. After all, to them, the enemy was now being defeated, and it was the perfect time to go after them. In a situation where there was no fighting spirit at all, a massacre would be much easier. Of course, it would be best if he could kill them until their morale was scattered and the morale of the army collapsed. The rough-looking man immediately began to give orders to set up Spring Sun City. After all, this was just the beginning, and they still needed to make some preparations. After giving out a few orders, the rough-looking man's gaze fell on the old man who had already fainted. "Tell me, why do you have to do this? You risked your life to block a few attacks. How much time can you buy?" The rough-looking man said disdainfully while stepping on the old Prime Minister's head. However, the rough-looking man did not use any strength because he felt that the old man's position in the Four-Realm Alliance was not bad. If they could make good use of him, he might even contribute to their great cause. Moreover, he might even save them a lot of trouble. That's right, the bones of human cultivators have always been relatively soft. When the time comes, we'll torture him well, and he'll naturally say what he wants to say. The rough-looking man said with some pride. War had always been about strength, but sometimes with some small tricks one might be able to gain some unexpected gains. However, the old man's body suddenly sank into the ground and disappeared. Chapter 2241. At this moment, the coarse man's expression changed drastically. The old man had been right under his feet. How could he have disappeared for no reason? Moreover, even his aura had disappeared without a trace. It was as if the old man had been swallowed up after he fell into the ground. Who the hell is it that dared to do this right under my nose? What a powerful technique. The coarse man glanced over as he spoke. At the same time, his aura surged out. His entire aura had become extraordinary. He knew that the other party was not weak, since he could perform such a technique. Moreover, his ability was probably not to be underestimated. Since the other party could do this, he must be nearby. He had to find him. Otherwise, it would be a disaster for them. Unrivaled God had already started retreating when he saw the enemy's army move out. After all, since there was no way to save the old Prime Minister, he had no choice but to leave. Moreover, the most important thing now was to gather all his forces to defend Summit Victory. Unrivaled God knew very well that if Xiaoyang could make it in time, he would not hesitate at all. He was probably retreating because he needed to buy time. However, not long after he left, Unrivaled God saw a black shadow descending from the sky. Unrivaled God frowned when he saw the figure. He caught it immediately. When he realized it was the old Prime Minister, he could not help but frown slightly as well. Soon after, he began to laugh. Unrivaled God knew very well that Xiaoyang was probably the only person in the drifting cloud realm who had such a technique. As for why he did not personally evacuate with the old Prime Minister, the reason was probably very simple. He needed to buy time. Since Xiaoyang had arrived, Unrivaled God had nothing to worry about. At the very least, if Xiaoyang was in charge of Mount Triumph, then they wouldn't be completely defenseless. They might even be able to defend that place. In Spring Sun City, the coarse man suddenly rose from the ground. He began a quick search wherever he looked. However, a young man walked over with a sword in his hand. He looked very calm. Seeing that the other party didn't try to hide and instead directly walked out, the coarse man couldn't help but feel a little shocked. In fact, he even felt that it was somewhat unreal. Soon after, the coarse man smiled. "Since you've taken the initiative to appear, there's no need for me to go through so much trouble to find you." However, that smile quickly froze. The coarse man's thoughts were also very meticulous, because he sensed that his opponent was a second-level martial emperor. Coupled with the fact that he was holding a sword, the only possibility was probably the ruler of the flowing cloud realm, Xiaoyang. Logically speaking, Xiaoyang should be tied down by Beilijan in the distant southern paradise, so he had no time to come here. But now he had appeared in front of him. The outcome of this matter was self-evident. I didn't think that Beilijan would still lose. Moreover, he lost so quickly, the coarse man said unwillingly. This was also something that he had not expected. Such an unforeseen event had caught him completely off guard. As for the young man in front of him, How terrifying was his strength! Xiao Yang stood with his sword in hand as he glared at his opponent. His gaze was sharp and piercing. He knew this person from Bailey Fang's spiritual soul. This person was called Bailey Z, and he was also a third-level martial emperor in the White Bear tribe. He was a core member. Furthermore, Bailey Z's strength could be considered to be among the best among those of the same cultivation level. At least, Bailey Kwong and Bailey Fong didn't think that they were a match for Bailey Z. The rough-looking man also carefully observed his opponent. He was also very curious in his heart. What kind of person could accomplish such a shocking feat? You killed Bailey Zhen? Bailey Z still couldn't believe it. He wanted to confirm it. Although he already knew the answer in his heart, he still wanted to confirm it. Xiao Yang didn't hide it. He just nodded with a smile. After getting a definite answer, Bailey Z's face turned extremely ugly at this moment. It was as if everything was a foregone conclusion. What a powerful lad. You actually killed 3 of our Bailey clan's third-level experts. You are indeed powerful. Bailey Z took a deep breath and said with a smile. Bailey Z really admired this young man. He had ascended from the 3,000 small worlds and had such strength. What kind of monstrous talent did he have to have? How terrifying would his strength be? You are much more powerful than them. Xiao Yang said in a deep voice. In terms of aura, Bailey Z was much more powerful than them. Moreover, this person's temperament was also very stable. It would be difficult to find a flaw in him. Bailey Z didn't deny this affirmation. Or it could be said that there had always been a consensus about such news. Although Bailey Z was furious when he found out that Bailey Zhen was killed by the person in front of him, he didn't rush to make a move. He still looked very calm. Moreover, he was still chatting and laughing as he prepared to get some useful information. This showed how terrifying his temperament was. That was why he was so calculative. Xiao Yang was feeling a lot of pressure now, so he didn't dare to act rashly. Of course, the reason he showed up this time was only to distract his opponent so that he couldn't chase after him personally. The previous battle with Bailey Zhen and the fact that he had rushed over had caused him to lose some of his strength. Once the battle started, he wouldn't be in his best state. It was inevitable that there would be some shortcomings. Bailey Z didn't dare to act rashly. In his opinion, if this lad killed one of his comrades, it could be due to luck. However, counting from the very beginning, he had killed 3 people with his own hands. This was enough to see how powerful he was. Although he was only a 2nd-level martial emperor, his strength was comparable to a 3rd-level martial emperor. In fact, he was even stronger than those weaker 3rd-level martial emperors. If it wasn't for this, he wouldn't have been able to survive until now. Moreover, he was still standing there calmly. You have a good eye, lad. Since that's the case, a wise man submits to circumstances. Why don't you join our White Bear tribe? We'll definitely treat you as a high-class guest. If you make any contributions in the future, you'll be given the position of a high priest. Bailey Z smiled. Chapter 2243. In Bailey Z's memory, the experts had always been in a group. However, Xiao Yang was guarding the huge drifting cloud world by himself. Why did he do that? Furthermore, his actions were delaying his own cultivation. That was because he needed to focus more on his own world. In this war, there were many things that he needed to do personally. If there were any mistakes, he would be consigned to eternal damnation. This kind of mental and physical exertion was meaningless. However, if he joined the White Bear tribe, it would be different. At that time, he would have countless resources to enjoy. He would even have a lot of time to cultivate. Moreover, he would have the guidance of an expert. However, what he needed to do now was to use his own strength to drag the world forward. Moreover, this world would be a burden to him. Bailey Z felt that Xiao Yang could possess such strength as a 2nd-order martial king. If he had the guidance of an expert, his strength would be limitless in the future. That was also the reason why he wanted to recruit him. If Xiaoyang was willing to surrender to the White Bear tribe, what was the death of those people? Even if they spent their entire lives, they would not be as important as Xiaoyang. Moreover, they were killed by a second-order martial king, Xiaoyang. Their ability was only SOSO. Even if they spent more resources, the results would be very low. If it was gone, it would be gone. However, this young man was different. Will you betray your own world? Xiaoyang asked in return. This question stunned Bai Lizi for a moment. Then he recovered and smiled. My world is strong enough. Of course, I will not betray it. Hearing this, Xiaoyang already had an idea in his heart. Although Bai Lizi said that he would not betray it, when a stronger world came to recruit him, he would probably surrender without hesitation. It seemed that the people of the Myriad Beast realm were only SOSO. The foundation of all of this was only built on the foundation of prosperity. Perhaps when they were no longer strong, the Myriad Beast realm would fall apart. The heart of a beast was only SOO. I think you should consider it carefully. There's no need to force yourself into a dead end. How long do you think you can hold off our White Bear tribe by yourself? Half a month? 1 month? Or a year? Maybe a few years? No matter how strong you are, I'm afraid you'll be worn down by us. At that time, even if you lose your life, this world will still be destroyed. Then, what is the point of your persistence? Bai Lizi asked. If they could recruit him, then their White Bear clan would be like a tiger that had grown wings. At the very least, this deal seemed feasible to him. After all, this young man had given people too many surprises. Who knew what kind of surprise he would give people next? Such a person naturally needed to be respected. As long as he could bring them under his command, everything else would be fine. Nothing else mattered. Moreover, Xiaoyang knew that as a core member of the Four Realm Alliance, once he betrayed them, it would be a heavy blow to the entire alliance. At that time, the overall situation would naturally be set. Even the White Bear clan would have to make fewer sacrifices in this war. Even if it's just for a day, I'll still hold them off. After all, it was this world that raised me. If you want me to betray it and turn against my own world, isn't that an ungrateful act? After hearing my analysis, do you still dare to accept people who betray their own world? Xiaoyang asked with a smile. This was where Xiao Yang's bottom line was. If a world did not betray him, but instead turned against him because of wealth and glory, then it was not a good character. At least to his heart, he would not be able to get over it. If you only wanted to go to higher places, then there would naturally be no problem. That was only leaving, not betraying. Hearing this, Bai Lizi couldn't help but frown. I don't think it's a big deal. Bai Lizi smiled faintly. In their Myriad Beast realm, this kind of action did not seem to be a problem. When such an answer came out, Xiaoyang smiled helplessly. Such an answer was really unexpected. It seemed that there was a huge difference between a human's heart and a beast's heart. You think it's a big deal, but I can't accept it. Xiaoyang said coldly. Bai Lizi also frowned slightly. He couldn't understand the young man's thoughts. What was he thinking to make such a decision? Or was there a problem with his thoughts? Or perhaps the difference in the world led to a difference in culture. It seemed that there was still some discrepancy in their views. I've already said all that I can say. If you don't know what's good for you, then don't blame me for being merciless. Bai Lizi's expression suddenly changed as he shouted. In his eyes, Xiaoyang was refusing a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Moreover, his choice was a little too rash. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, waved the divine sword in his hand. Although he was a little wary before, although he was a little afraid, when it came to the situation where he had no choice but to fight, he would not hesitate. No matter how strong you are still a third-level martial emperor. Xiaoyang is not without means and ability to fight against you. In fact, the moment you reveal a flaw, you can even be killed. After Bai Lizi sensed his opponent's aura, he could not help but frown slightly. The battle intent in his aura was very clear. He had wasted so much time talking to him because he wanted him to understand. But who would have thought that this person would be so stubborn? "Looks like you want to drink a forfeit," Bailey Z said, unable to suppress the anger in his heart. Bailey Z did not like to do meaningless things. Xiao Yang's rejection made everything he had done so meaningless. That was why he was so angry. The White Bear warriors in Spring Sun City all widened their eyes. They also wanted to see how their leader would teach this arrogant brat a lesson. However, those who knew some inside information had their expressions become much more solemn. This was because they knew very well that if Bailizi was defeated, their morale would take a huge hit. "It seems that I have no choice but to drink a forfeit." Xiao Yang shook his head and said helplessly. Chapter 2244. The situation became tense at this moment. Swords were drawn, and a great battle seemed to be about to break out. Bailizi and Xiao Yang were not in a hurry to make a move. They were carefully watching their opponents. This was because they knew that their opponents were very strong, and they could not afford to underestimate them. Moreover, they needed to see their opponents' moves clearly so that they could quickly find their flaws. As long as their opponents revealed their flaws, they could immediately launch a counterattack. It was even possible that they could directly decide the outcome of the battle. It could be said that the two of them were wary of each other, so they did not dare to make a move easily. They were afraid that if they made a wrong move, it would lead to a situation where they would lose everything. Although Bailizi did not need to feel this psychological pressure at all, he had to be careful because of the loss of his comrades. This kid must have some unique method to be able to challenge someone of a higher level and kill his opponent. Although Bailey Zhen had told him everything during the battle in West Wind City, it was still not enough. However, he felt that there must be some details that had been overlooked. Otherwise, how could he have possibly killed Bailey Foam with those attacks he had used? As for where the trick was, Bailizi did not know. That was why he was so cautious right now. He was afraid that he would fall into a trap if he wasn't careful. If he lost his life, it would be too late for regrets. Xiao Yang was not in a hurry to make a move because he could feel from his opponent's aura that he was an extremely difficult opponent to deal with. He could not afford to be careless. Moreover, Xiao Yang did not mind spending more time to recover his strength. There was no harm in delaying it for a while. The two of them stared at each other like this, as if neither of them was willing to make the first move. The fear between them made them very tacit, and they did not dare to act rashly. On the contrary, the people watching the battle below seemed to be a little impatient. This was because they could not understand why their leader was so wary of the kid who was only a level 2 martial emperor. What was the reason for all of this? This was indeed a little confusing, but they didn't dare to open their mouths for fear of disrupting his train of thought. Bailey Z's mind was also very active. He had gone through several deductions in his mind, trying to find a reasonable tactic to use. After about half a cup of tea's time, Bailizi seemed to have understood something. He immediately roared and revealed his true form. In the next instant, Bailey Z launched an attack. Before this, Bailey Z had considered too many things. However, he had overlooked one thing, and that was that if Xiao Yang wanted to kill Bailey Zhen, it wouldn't be an easy matter. Therefore, he must have used some great method. The reason why he had not taken the initiative to attack all this time was probably very simple. He was stalling for time so that he could recover more strength. After thinking about this, Bailizi knew that he couldn't continue to be stubborn. Doing that would only give the enemy more time to recover. In fact, there might even be mistakes in doing so. Seeing that Bailizi had suddenly revealed his true form and was about to attack, Xiao Yang coldly snorted and slashed out with his sword. Suddenly, an extremely tyrannical and majestic sword intent came slashing down. On top of the sword intent, there was a layer of fire that was extraordinarily hot. Although it hadn't reached him yet, Bailey Z could already feel that his skin was about to be burnt. From this, it could be seen how terrifying the power of this sword was. If he was the slightest bit careless, he might even be at a disadvantage under this sword. However, he did not retreat at all. After all, this was just the beginning of the fight. If he retreated now, it would be a very heavy blow to his aura. At this moment, the lightning leaped out like a fish, extremely ferocious. In the blink of an eye, the lightning wrapped around Bailey Z's arms like chains. They were like gauntlets that were indestructible. Bailey Z's fist came down and directly hit the flaming sword intent. Immediately, the sound of tremors rang out, and even he was forced to take a step back. However, the sword aura was shattered by the punch. It turned into countless sparks and fell to the ground. Bailey Z glanced at the burnt skin on the back of his hand and couldn't help but frown slightly. He didn't expect that there would be some that slipped through the net and hurt his skin. This was something that Bailey Z didn't expect. However, this was no longer the main point. After all, he already had some understanding of Xiaoyang's strength and was no longer as ignorant as before. This person's sword intent was indeed tyrannical and very sharp. This was just a hurried sword strike. If it was a sword strike with accumulated power, how terrifying would its power be? These thoughts appeared in Bailey Z's mind, and he began to plan again. He didn't dare to be careless in the slightest. Now, Xiaoyang also felt a great amount of pressure. Facing such an opponent, he did indeed feel that it was a little strenuous. If he didn't use the power of the world to suppress it, it wouldn't be easy to defeat it. However, if he didn't have the determination to kill it, the power of the world couldn't be used easily. Moreover, even if he didn't rely on the power of the world, he could still defeat his opponent. A martial emperor who was forged by 9 small spiritual veins was naturally not simple. The more hardships he suffered, the more powerful he would be in the future. Effort and reward had always been closely related. Unless one was a person with great luck, perhaps with a little effort, one could reach a realm that ordinary cultivators couldn't reach in their lifetime. However, if one didn't put in any effort, one would only be injured in the end. Based on your sword strike, it is indeed comparable to a 3rd-level martial emperor cultivator. Bailey Z said coldly. When these words came out, the expressions of the warriors in Spring Sun City changed drastically. Previously, they thought that Bailey Feng had fallen here because he wasn't skilled enough. However, now that this kid had gained Bailey Z's approval, no one dared to question him. Just what kind of monster was he? Just how terrifying was his talent to be able to reach this step? No matter how they thought about it, most of them had no answer in their hearts. This was because this was beyond common sense. Did he really advance from the 3,000 small worlds? Chapter 2245. Pushing your own small world into the 3,000 medium worlds with your own strength is indeed a magnificent feat that no ordinary person can accomplish. I think you must have received a gift from the heavenly way because of this. That's why your strength is so formidable, Bailey said with a smile. Some of the doubts and knots in his heart were completely resolved at this moment. To be able to promote one's own small world, it was naturally impossible for one to do so without some ability. This point was enough to explain a lot of problems. Previously, he had underestimated them because he had not thought through the key points in this matter. In the end, he had even sacrificed his own life. Bai Li Feng and the others were obviously such fools. They had thought that the experts in the small world were just chickens and pottery dogs. That was why they had been killed by their opponents. Xiaoyang, on the other hand, grinned and didn't deny it. This was because he had received a gift from the world spirit. Otherwise, how could his 9 small spiritual veins have been condensed so quickly? Moreover, without the help of the world spirit, Xiaoyang had tried to condense 7 spiritual veins. 7 spiritual veins was his limit. It was a good thing that everything had progressed very smoothly. The process was also very dangerous. However, it was also because of this that Xiaoyang had become who he was today, and that he possessed such powerful strength. It seems that I was right. It seems that you are not easy to deal with. You have your advantages, and I also have my advantages. Let's see which of us can exert our advantages to the maximum and crush the other. Bailisi said with a smile. As soon as he finished speaking, Bailisi's expression became much more serious. At this moment, he could be said to be clearly aware that he was facing a bitter battle, and he absolutely couldn't relax in the slightest. In fact, there were many times when he needed to be calm and pay attention to every detail. He did not want to give his opponent a chance to take advantage of him. Thunderstorm World! Bailisi shouted. Instantly, the battle intent in his body exploded. It quickly turned into bolts of lightning and swept out. The power contained in each bolt of lightning was not to be underestimated. It could be said that any one of the bolts of lightning was enough to kill a cultivator below the martial emperor realm. The martial skill that Bailisi used was not just a little bit stronger than Bailey Fang's. In an instant, Xiao Yang's expression became serious. Facing such an opponent, he did not dare to let his guard down. This was mainly because they were too afraid of the other party, so every time they attacked, they were very restrained. Moreover, every move was calculated, and he did not dare to act recklessly. It was also because they had a backup plan that no matter which side it would be difficult for them to advance recklessly. In fact, if he made the wrong decision, he might even suffer in the end. Bolts of lightning surged violently, as if the heavens were unpredictable as they galloped forward. Plunder like fire! 7 steps of the barbarian god. Xiao Yang shouted in a low voice. Suddenly, he disappeared from the spot. When he reappeared, he was only 100 feet away from Bailisi. He held a crimson divine sword in his hand, which was covered in flames. Countless crimson sword qi constantly appeared. Every sword qi looked as if it was real. Just one glance was enough to make people feel that it was incomparably dazzling. At this moment, a scorching aura filled the battlefield. At this moment, Bailisi also felt a huge pressure. The combination of the two martial skills also made Xiao Yang's movements extremely strange. His position was constantly changing. Those crimson red sword auras were constantly appearing everywhere. It could be said that their might was terrifying. Bailisi couldn't help but frown when he saw the scarlet red sword qi all around him. Now he realized that this kid's strength was indeed not simple. This move was already extraordinary. Soon after, Bailisi slowly closed his eyes. Sometimes, what one saw might not necessarily be the truth. Instead, it would cause one to become much more sluggish. However, his feelings would not be wrong. Furthermore, Xiao Yang's target was his own body. Even if he continued to change his position, his final target would definitely not change in the slightest. After grasping this point, Bailisi's heart was suddenly enlightened. He knew what he should do next. However, what Bailisi felt next greatly disappointed him. This was because his feelings told him that he was completely in a sea of fire. Moreover, the youth's speed was also very fast. It was difficult to predict. "Withdraw!" Bailisi shouted in a low voice. Suddenly, all the energy that had exploded out began to shrink back to his body. In the blink of an eye, the crimson sword qi came from all directions. Bailisi continuously exploded with lightning, shattering all the sword qi. "You're here!" Bailisi suddenly noticed Xiao Yang's position. Without hesitation, he threw out a punch. Immediately, the countless lightning bolts seemed to be attracted by something and shot towards the direction of the punch. Xiao Yang had already thrown out his sword. It was impossible for him to withdraw it. This Bailisi's strength was indeed extraordinary. Who would have thought that he would be able to find clues like this? He was indeed very powerful. Xiao Yang did not have any intention of retreating. His sword was still there. Boom! Both of their auras also erupted at this moment. Under the vibration of their power, it was even more violent and difficult to control. Under such an explosion, the two of them were unable to control their own bodies, and both of them were sent flying. Pine Victory Mountain. Ji Fei stood on the highest peak at the front. Behind him, there were a few capable subordinates who stood there for him to pass down orders. After a while, he saw the troops from Spring Sun City begin to come in one after another. At the same time, Ji Fei was also carefully observing. Although they were all comrades, it might not be a good thing for them if the people from the Myriad Beast realm were to sneak in. Although Ji Fei had arrived long ago, there were still some cultivators from West Wind City who had not completely entered Pine Victory Mountain. Because their strength was not on the same level, their speed was naturally different. The formation had also been fully activated. As for how long it could stop the army from West Wind City, he did not know. However, he must come to Pine Victory Mountain as soon as possible and suppress this place first. If he came late, there would be no one to lead this place. Once they were taken advantage of, they might be sandwiched in the middle and attacked from both sides. Chapter 2246. If they were to face a situation where they were attacked from the front and the back, perhaps everyone would be sandwiched in the middle. At that time, they would have to close the door and beat the dogs. The worst result would be that they would all be wiped out. If that were to happen, perhaps most of the elites in the Drifting Cloud realm would be completely lost. By then, they would no longer have the ability to fight back. Ji Fei was still very calm when it came to making a choice between right and wrong. Naturally, he knew what to do. Even if he was unwilling, he still had to look at the big picture. As the weaker party, they could not afford to make any mistakes. If they were not careful, they might fall into a bottomless abyss. They had to be careful with every step they took. They could not afford to make any mistakes. Ji Fei only heaved a sigh of relief now that he had fully activated the formations in the mountain. At the same time, he also ordered the cultivators to be on guard and not leave the mountain. If they found any traces of the enemy, they only had to report it. Now that unrivaled god and the old prime minister had not returned, Ji Fei was very upset. He could only guard the front alone. The other places were still in a state of emptiness. Although Chu Taiyin and Xiao Changsheng at the second line of defense could be mobilized, they were in charge of checking if the enemy had infiltrated from other places. They had to be on guard against that. One could even say that they could not afford to have any problems. They had to be careful. Not long after, Chu Nanfeng arrived. He led a group of soldiers and quickly rushed into the Triumph Mountain. However, there was a problem with the number of soldiers he led. Moreover, Chu Nanfeng's expression was extremely wretched. He must have encountered something that caused him to be in such a state. Soon after, Ji Fei helplessly shook his head and sighed. Since Chu Nanfeng had come alone, it meant that their arrogance had harmed them. The arrogance of the God realm had been around for a long time. Who didn't know that? However, he did not expect them to bring this problem into the battle formation. This made him very helpless. Since things had come to this, there was no point in saying anything more. As for how much their arrogance would be damaged, that was not something Ji Fei could predict. The most important thing now was how to guard Pine Victory Mountain well and wait for Xiaoyang to return from the distant southern grotto heaven. Now, Ji Fei felt that the burden on his shoulders had become even heavier. It was so heavy that he could barely breathe. After Chu Nanfeng entered the mountain, he quickly met up with Ji Fei. Ji Fei only took a glance and realized that Chu Nanfeng looked hurried. He even had some injuries. It was obvious that he had fought with someone. Of course, it was not bad that he could come back alive. Otherwise, if they were to be completely annihilated in Spring Sun City, it was inevitable that someone would make an issue of it. They might even say that the Drifting Cloud realm and did not save them. Although there were sensible people who would suppress such news, it was still a disaster in the end. How to develop from here on out was also a difficult problem in his heart. When Chu Nanfeng saw that Ji Fei's expression remained indifferent, his expression immediately turned ugly. He felt that he was in the wrong and lowered his head. "I'm sorry this time. We messed up the situation," Chu Nanfeng said through gritted teeth. Even now, Chu Nanfeng felt extremely aggrieved. What the hell was going on? Furthermore, they had never experienced such a battle formation before. All along, it had been the realm of the gods who suppressed others. When had they been suppressed by other realms? It could even be said that they did not have the ability to resist. They had never fought such a humiliating battle before. Moreover, how could they fight it? It seemed that no matter how they fought, it would be difficult to win. It's nothing. Just follow orders, Ji-Fei said. Now was not the time to find out who was right and who was wrong. The most important thing was to stabilize the emperor's heart. Ji-Fei thought for a moment and said, "Go and reorganize the troops immediately. Then, head to the North Mountain to set up a defense. Do not slack off." Chu Nanfeng glanced at this younger generation member. Soon after, he solemnly nodded and said, "All right." Previously, he had suffered because he didn't listen to orders. Now, if he still wanted to take advantage of his seniority, according to his way of doing things, he was afraid that he would only make more mistakes. The wrong decision in Spring Sun City had cost the old Prime Minister his life. Chu Nanfeng Chu was just a defeated soldier who had fled in a hurry. What right did he have to be arrogant? Moreover, after entering the mountain, Chu Nanfeng realized that the West Wind City's defenders had retreated very decisively. They had preserved almost all their strength. Ji-Fei was still standing on the mountain peak, observing and waiting. He was waiting for Shen Wushuang to arrive. Once Shen Wushuang arrived, he would not have to ask Chu Taiyin and Xiao Chongxing to come. The gap in the south could also be filled. Soon, Ji-Fei saw some wounded soldiers returning. He could not help but feel a pang in his heart. If they did not question the orders, why would they do this? After waiting for a long time, Ji-Fei saw Shen Wushuang's figure. A knowing smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Now that he was back, it was enough. The defense of Summit Victory Mountain could also be done to the maximum. As for the gap in the rear, it did not matter if it could not be filled. After all, if they wanted to go to the rear, they would have to pass by the other two sides. When the time came, they would be able to find some clues. "I can't believe you managed to save him. That's amazing." Ji-Fei's smile deepened when he saw Shen Wushuang carrying someone on his back. After Xiao Yang retreated, his expression became extremely serious. He looked at the wound on his chest and could not help but frown. How overbearing was that breath of will! But it was still unable to completely block the power of that punch, causing him to suffer quite a bit. However, it was only a superficial wound. How to fight next became the number one question in Xiao Yang's mind. To kill or not to kill, that was a choice he had to make. If he used everything he had, it was still possible to kill Bailey Z. However, that was not a sure thing. Moreover, he might need to expend more energy. If his energy was severely depleted, it would be difficult to defend Victory Mountain. It could be said that Xiao Yang was very conflicted now. How to make a decision had become a choice he had to make at the moment. He could not even allow himself to make the slightest mistake. He had to plan everything well. Meanwhile, Bailey Z looked much calmer. There was even a hint of confusion in his eyes. It was as if he had not recovered from what had happened earlier. Chapter 2247. Bailey Z looked at the wound on his fist that was so deep that his bones could be seen. His eyes started to throb a little, because he felt that this matter was indeed a little mysterious. Moreover, there were countless small burn marks around the sword wound. They didn't look big, but they were all bleeding. The power of that sword was so strong. Bailey Z thought in his heart and felt a little shocked. The White Bear clan was known for their strong physical bodies. However, the power of that sword was able to hurt him. On this point, Bailey Z didn't dare to underestimate them anymore. Moreover, that was under the condition that he went all out to deal with it. If he was caught off guard and got hit by the sword, wouldn't his arm be cut in half? Bailey Z couldn't help but shiver as he thought about it, because he felt that it was indeed very scary, as expected of a middle-grade spiritual weapon. This kind of sharpness is frightening. Bailey Z smiled. Even in the 3,000 medium worlds, spiritual artifacts were rare. Moreover, for a spiritual weapon of a slightly higher grade, if a lower-grade spiritual weapon was used as a foundation, it could be said to be 1 in 100. Thus, it could be seen how rare it was. Of course, this was only in the knowledge of the Wan Shou realm. As for the realm of beasts, they had never relied on magic artifacts. What they relied on was their own strength. That was enough for him. In the eyes of many almighties, magic weapons were just a burden. It was already extraordinary to be able to use one's physical body to the fullest. What the heavens gave was the mystery of the physical body. Xiao Yang, on the other hand, had a smile on his face. He had never thought that the prize he had obtained in the great competition of the realm of the gods would have such an achievement after such a long time had passed. Of course, he still had to thank the world spirit for this. It had used countless methods to forge this middle-grade spiritual weapon. Now, it seemed that the world spirit's method was indeed very suitable. Moreover, it also allowed Xiao Yang's strength to increase tremendously. If that's all, you might not be able to kill me. Bai Lizi smiled. Bai Lizi felt that he had met his match. Moreover, this opponent was very difficult to deal with. Moreover, Bai Lizi also felt that his opponent's killing intent was very strong. In other words, one of them might fall here today and never be able to stand up again. However, Bai Lizi didn't want to be the one to fall, but he had no choice but to be cautious with the sharpness of the spirit weapon. Any sword that could easily cut through his flesh would make him tremble in fear. One had to know that the White Bear clan had always been proud of the toughness of their skin and flesh, which was enough to render most cultivators helpless. However, his opponent was able to break through his defense. In that case, his strength seemed to be somewhat lacking. If he lost his greatest advantage, then he would have to be extremely careful with every move he made. He couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Otherwise, there would definitely be an additional wound on his body. Xiao Yang held the divine sword horizontally in front of his chest. Now he wanted to give it a try. If there was a chance, he would kill Bai Lizi. If his opponent lost another third-level martial royal realm expert, who was also a leading figure, then the enemy's triangular formation would be weakened. When that time came, he would be able to launch a surprise attack and defeat the enemy. When that time came, the other side would also be in a state where it would be difficult to support the enemy alone. It would only be a matter of time before he took down the enemy. Thinking of this, Xiao Yang already had a plan in his mind. If he couldn't take down the enemy, then there was nothing he could do. After all, sometimes one couldn't force things. Everything depended on the opportunity. It seems that you are very confident. Speaking of which, if I had your strength, I'm afraid that I would be extremely arrogant. Bai Lizi said with a smile. While he was joking, Bai Lizi had already secretly activated his power and was ready to attack. Xiao Yang smiled indifferently. He waved the divine sword in his hand and said, "Your strength is only so." Faced with such mockery, Bai Lizi just smiled. There was no point in using such a despicable method. Was Bai Lizi trying to provoke him and make him lose his composure? Although he looked rough, it didn't mean that he was a brainless brute. He, Bai Lizi, was indeed a brute, but he was also a brute with a brain. Therefore, he didn't think much of Bai Lizi's mockery. In fact, he even wanted to laugh in his heart. He felt that such a method was indeed a little inferior. In the blink of an eye, lightning flashed brightly. The attack that Bai Lizi had been preparing could no longer be suppressed at this moment. It even started to become a little violent. Now his attitude was very clear. He was going to take down Bai Lizi. Upon seeing this, Xiao Yang held the divine sword horizontally. His finger gently rubbed across the surface of the sword. Traces of lightning continuously blossomed from the sword. Suddenly, the crimson sword body dimmed and was covered by a layer of lightning. The bolts of lightning were constantly condensing. When Bai Lizi saw this scene, he was stunned because he felt that his opponent's style didn't seem to be in line with common sense. The White Bear tribe didn't just have rough skin and thick flesh. They were also talented. They were naturally closer to lightning, so they could control it easily. It could be said that they were born with this method. Bai Lizi was prepared to use lightning to deal with him. Could it be that there was something wrong with his brain? Was that why he made the wrong judgment? However, Bai Lizi quickly denied his own thoughts. He didn't think that his opponent was a fool. Since he had chosen to use this move, it meant that he was prepared. There must be a secret behind it. That was why he was so daring. Otherwise, only a fool would make such a decision if attacking the enemy's strength didn't give him a huge advantage. Now, Bailizi was even more curious. What kind of good thing did Xiao Yang prepare for him? That was why he was so daring. While thinking, Bailizi's hands didn't stop moving. Thoughts were thoughts, but he couldn't stop attacking. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a good thing if Bailizi seized the opportunity. Analyzing the battle situation was important, but it couldn't be ignored. Vast field of lightning. Chapter 2248. Suddenly, with Bailizi as the center, a thunderstorm was formed once again. The aura was much stronger than before. The lightning began to swirl around like a hurricane, whistling endlessly. The sound was vast and deafening. Those who heard it could not help but tremble with fear. Even the white bear warriors below, who were born with the power of lightning, could not help but feel fear when this move appeared. That was the fear of great power. It was the weakness of every living creature. Some of the weaker ones even prostrated on the ground, trembling as if their lives were on the line. Fear was something that could cause any living being to lose their rationality and fall into an endless state of fear. It was normal for them to lose their rationality because of it. Bailizi's strength was terrifying and pure. Naturally, his premeditated attack would not be so simple. Moreover, he wanted to take down Xiao Yang in this battle. Therefore, he had to use some trump cards. Although his cultivation level was higher than his opponent's, his strength was comparable to a rank 3 martial king. Under such circumstances, he could not underestimate his opponent. Bailizi was an opponent who was on par with him. This was also the reason why Bailizi was so cautious. This was also why he had always been one of the best among those in the same cultivation level. No matter what he did, he had a plan. Unless he was completely suppressed, he would use his brain, calmly analyze everything, and be ready for battle. Even though he knew that his opponent was only a rank 2 martial king, he did not dare to be careless. Looking at the surging thunderbolts, Xiao Yang could not help but frown slightly. What he could sense was that the power of this attack was many times stronger than before. Right now, Bailizi was prepared to end this battle as soon as possible. Since that was the case, Xiao Yang was not afraid. It was just a battle. Let's go all out and see who was more powerful. Thousand poison, thunder, dragon roar. With a low shout, the divine sword in Xiao Yang's hand shone brightly. In an instant, the power of the thunderbolts poured out like a flood. It was very powerful. In the next moment, Xiao Yang raised his spirits and prepared to fight to the death. He wanted to see who could handle the overall situation and the details better. It had to be said that Xiao Yang was very confident in this. Come on then. Bailizi shouted excitedly when he saw his opponent charging towards him. The thunderbolts continued to stir. Every bolt of lightning was like a hurricane, domineering and sharp. Xiao Yang also charged over. That lightning dragon directly charged forward. As it twisted its body, it completely knocked aside those hurricane-like thunderbolts. However, because of the thunderbolts, the lightning dragon's trajectory deviated. This was not a big problem. Xiao Yang immediately. He followed, closely behind. He wanted to try and see if he could finish off Bailizi with a strike or even kill him with his sword. Seeing his opponent rushing over without a care for his life, Bailizi could not help but feel his blood boiling. To be able to fight with such a person was indeed a great thing in life. Therefore, Bailizi also rushed over. Wherever the lightning dragon passed, it could be said to be extremely fierce. Because of Xiao Yang's support from behind, although the speed at which the power was weakened was very fast, the speed at which it was replenished was not slow either. Countless lightning bolts continued to bombard Xiao Yang's body. Xiao Yang's body suffered a few heavy blows, to the point that even his body was greatly shaken. However, he was still extremely determined as he thrust out his sword. Xiao Yang's idea was very simple. After thrusting out his sword, He did not care about anything else. As long as the sword reached its target, it was enough. Under the challenge of a higher level, it was necessary to have such an imposing manner to be able to create a miracle. If he was always afraid of the slightest thing and schemed, then it might limit his own strength. Xiao Yang did not have the qualifications to limit his own strength. He could only fight with the heart to win. Bai Lizi saw that the person actually endured the thunderbolts and rushed over. He could not help but be shocked and angry. Could it be that he really went crazy? If that is the case, then let's see what use your madness has. Bai Lizi roared angrily. He clasped his hands together and grabbed the lightning dragon. No matter how much it twisted, he still held it tightly. However, in the next moment, Bai Lizi immediately let go of his hands. He immediately clenched his fists and punched out. Only now did Bai Lizi realize that Xiao Yang's killing move was in the sword in his hand. As for the mighty thunder dragon, it was just trying to cover up the fact that it was making things more conspicuous. One had to say that this kind of calculation was very deep. This person's mind was indeed very scary. He had a hidden killing move. If Bai Lizi had not been in battle for a long time and had participated in more than 100 battles, he might have really fallen into this kid's trap. Since he could see where the killing move was, he naturally had a way to deal with it. At this moment, Xiao Yang's lips curled into a smile. Perhaps it was because of the thunderbolts, but that smile was especially strange. It was as if he had a plan that had already succeeded. That was why he was so proud. Bai Lizi also happened to see the smile. He was also a little uncertain. Which one was the killing move? Or was this kid playing a psychological game with him? Was he trying to make a mistake in his judgment so that he would lose? In an instant, countless doubts appeared in his mind and were instantly denied. Of course, the main reason was that Bai Lizi did not have so much time to think about it. The matter of battle formations was always changing. Most of the time, it was just a matter of improvisation. How could there be so many calculations? When some of the martial emperors in Spring Sun City saw this scene, the corners of their mouths twitched. Some of them even rubbed their eyes. They felt that this scene was too unreal. Was such a strong aura and attack really coming from a second-level martial emperor? Boom! With one punch, Xiao Yang was hit in the chest. He immediately flew out, unable to control himself. However, the lightning dragon that had broken free plunged into Bai Lizi's chest. Moreover, it was still moving at an extremely fast speed. It could be said that it was enjoying it. No matter how many thunderbolts there were, the lightning dragon seemed to be the strongest. Chapter 2249. After pushing Xiao Yang back with a punch, Bai Lizi immediately grabbed the lightning dragon with both hands. With a loud roar, the lightning dragon was shattered by the thunderbolts and turned into lightning bolts that fell one after another. After killing the lightning dragon, Bai Lizi staggered a few steps back. His chest was heaving up and down, and he looked a lot more dispirited. As for Xiao Yang, he stood still, and his face was extremely pale. Just now, he had forcefully taken that punch, and his internal organs had suffered quite a bit of shock because of it. In fact, his limbs and bones felt like they were about to fall apart. From this, it could be seen how terrifying the power of that punch was. It was true that Xiao Yang was already very powerful, and his body was extremely tough, but it was difficult for him to resist that punch. Even his divine sense was shaken. Fortunately, he stabilized his condition in the shortest time possible and stood with his sword in hand, ready to defend himself. Apart from Bai Lizi, if anyone else were to launch a sneak attack, they would be severely injured by him. Therefore, Xiao Yang was still quite confident. Furthermore, he was the only one who could be considered an opponent here. However, just this opponent alone was enough to make Xiao Yang feel a little tired. In fact, he almost fell into a trap. The people below were even more silent. They looked at the two people who had separated in the sky, and they were all dumbfounded. This was because no one had expected that the human cultivator would still be able to stand up after taking such a heavy blow. Could it be that his body is as tyrannical as mine? Even Bai Lizi, who had stabilized himself, had a look of surprise in his eyes. There were many whirlpool-like burn marks on Xiao Yang's body, which were left behind by the thunderbolts. And now he was actually able to stand up. This was more or less inconceivable. What's going on? Or is he really a monster, which is why he can withstand such an attack? Moreover, he only looked pale. Although his aura had weakened a lot, his fighting spirit did not diminish at all. In particular, his killing intent was even more tyrannical, as if it was unstoppable. What kind of monster are you? If it's just a gift from the heavenly Tao, you wouldn't be this strong. Bailey Z roared in disbelief. As he spoke, he spat out a mouthful of blood. The power of the lightning dragon's attack was naturally not to be underestimated. Furthermore, his current injuries were extremely serious. When the lightning dragon pierced through his body, Bailey's internal organs weren't spared either. But fortunately, his physical body was strong enough, so he was able to endure it and not directly fall to the ground or lose the ability to fight. However, everything that was happening in front of him was still somewhat incomprehensible. What was this all about? Was this guy really a monster? The more he thought about it, the more uncomfortable Bailey's felt. He felt that everything he had experienced today could no longer be judged by common sense, especially the strength displayed by this young man. No matter how he looked at it, it was not something a human cultivator could possess. Xiao Yang smiled faintly and said, "Looks like I'm going to win this round." Hearing this, Bailey Z could not help but frown slightly. He felt that this statement was a little too arrogant. Although he was hit by the lightning dragon, he did not lose the ability to fight. How could there be a winner? Or could it be that this guy had lost his mind, so he thought that this was the truth? If that was really the case, it would be a little funny. Aren't you saying this a little too early? Why do you think you've already won? Your hand of death didn't hit me. As Bailey Z spoke, he pointed at his own heart. In Bailey Z's opinion, the killing move from before was the divine sword piercing his heart, then using the sword intent in the sword edge to kill his life. However, he had failed. Xiao Yang smiled but did not say anything. This was because the previous attack would have killed him regardless of whether his opponent could block that move or not. If he wanted to live, he could only block both moves. However, Xiao Yang's smile quickly disappeared, and his eyebrows furrowed together. What? Where's your arrogance from before? What's with the look on your face now? Bailey Z laughed. From his point of view, Xiao Yang's plan must have failed, which was why his expression was so ugly. However, what Xiao Yang was worried about was not the battle here, but Pine Victory Mountain behind them. On Pine Victory Mountain, Ji Fei was still standing on top of the mountain, observing what was ahead. Previously, Unrivaled God had returned with the dying old Prime Minister on his back. That was a pleasant surprise to Lin Huang. At the same time, Ji Fei realized that the old Prime Minister was indeed capricious. That was why he had ended up like this. However, he did not expect him to be beaten so badly. From Unrivaled God, Ji Fei also learned that Xiao Yang was now stuck in Spring Sun City. If it were not for him, many of his comrades would not have been able to make it back. They were destined to die while being hunted down. Since Xiao Yang had returned from the distant southern grotto heaven, Ji Fei's heart was much more at ease. However, when he would arrive at Pine Victory Mountain to take charge was another question. Therefore, before Xiao Yang arrived, he still had to continue guarding the place. At the very least, Pine Victory Mountain's line of defense could not be lost. Meanwhile, Unrivaled God was still unable to calm down. This was because he watched the defeated army retreat into Pine Victory Mountain. He felt extremely helpless. The loss of these elites was not small. Many of them would not even be able to make it back. The reason for this was the old Prime Minister's arrogance. Because of one or two people's temperaments, countless good men had lost their lives. Ji Fei could not help but feel a little upset. Was it really that difficult to let go of one's pride and trust someone? Or was it that they were so used to being high and mighty that it was normal to have their temperament no matter what? If that was really the case, then such pedantry would really do a lot of harm. Seeing that the sun had begun to set in the west and night was about to arrive, Ji Fei's heart became even heavier. Defense after nightfall was especially important. This was because the enemy was about to arrive. Chapter 2250. Not long after, Ji Fei saw some small teams rushing over. They were all warriors from the White Bear clan, and they all looked extremely valiant. Some of the White Bear's fur was even dyed red with blood. It was obvious that they had killed many people along the way. According to the time, it was about time that these fellows broke through the formation and arrived here. Now that the Triumph Mountains formation had been fully activated, Ji Fei had nothing to fear. Moreover, it was only a small team, so there was nothing to be afraid of. As for the leader, although he was a second-order martial royal realm expert who could suppress all the heroes of the Pin Victory Mountain, it was still impossible for him to attack because of the formation support. Even if there were a few more martial emperors, it would be difficult for them to break through. The defensive line here could be said to be heavily set up, and Ji Fei was very confident about it. However, in the next moment, Ji Fei saw a large group of people coming over. There were even a few martial emperors among them. Immediately, Ji Fei's expression became extremely ugly. What he was afraid of really happened. In fact, as long as the path was cleared, it would naturally not be a problem for them to advance triumphantly. Prepare for battle. Ji Fei immediately shouted. If it was only a small team, Ji Fei only needed to guard this place, and it would not be a big deal. However, now that a large group of people was coming, it could not be ignored. If the other party launched an attack, he would definitely have to respond. Moreover, the formation could not be broken. In an instant, many of the soldiers on Triumph Mountain began to show their faces. They also knew what the current situation was. After retreating to this place, they no longer had any room to retreat. In fact, it was even possible for them to have a fight to the death here. In an instant, the hidden soldiers also appeared on their posts one after another. Each of them alternated in a horizontal manner, and they looked like iron buckets. Looking at the vicious, ferocious beasts, some of them could not help but feel fearful. However, they understood the mission they were shouldering, so they did not retreat at all. The previous retreat was to preserve their strength as much as possible. In that case, the current battle was to protect this pass and preserve the opportunity to counterattack. Each and every one of them could be said to be in high spirits. They naturally knew what kind of situation they were facing now, and they could not afford to make any mistakes. Ji Fei was extremely nervous now. If the enemy were to launch a large-scale attack, they would have to mobilize Unrivaled God and Chu Nanfeng to keep the place as stable as Mount Tai. However, if he did so, the defensive line on both sides would become empty. At that time, once the other party made a move, the consequences would be unpredictable. Under these circumstances, the pressure on Ji Fei increased. However, what comforted Ji Fei was that after the soldiers arrived, they set up camp on the spot and did not attack rashly. This made Ji Fei a little confused. What exactly were these guys selling in their gourds? However, from the crisscrossing of the tents, it could be seen that they were very solid. At the same time, there were two people looking at Taste Victory Mountain. They seemed to be arguing about something. In next to no time, their gazes fell upon Ji Fei, and there was even a hint of playfulness in their eyes. Just a simple exchange of glances was enough to make Ji Fei feel unbearable. That provocative look in his eyes caused him to burn with rage. If it were any other time, he would definitely charge out and determine the winner. However, he did not dare to act rashly now. There were too many powerhouses on the other side. Fighting head-on was not the way out. The only thing he could do now was to continue to wait for the arrival of the backbone. When the time came, he would do whatever the other party said. On the western plains of the Sword Heart realm, blood was flowing like a river. Under the setting sun, it looked especially red. The blood and the setting sun could be said to be particularly dazzling. The battle here was finally over. It could be said that more than half of the Ash Wolf clan and the army of the other clan were left here, never to return. Of course, the biggest gain in this battle was the killing of the purple-robed man who was a level 3 martial emperor. That was the biggest gain of the battle. The cultivators of the Sword Heart realm also began to clean up the battlefield. They began to clean up the bones of their comrades, so that they could be buried in the ground and rest in peace. Li Fengmu stood on a high ground, using the sky sword to support his body so that he would not fall down. In the previous battle between Blind Left and Blind Right, he had already been seriously injured. However, the only reason why he was able to persevere was that the Sword Heart realm could not fall. Now that the outcome of the battle had been determined, he breathed a sigh of relief. Instead, he felt a little tired and even a little difficult to hold on. At this time, Li Chuanyi walked over and immediately supported his ancestor. "Go find Bai Jian!" Li Fengmu shouted angrily. When Li Chuanyi heard this, seeing that the ancestor was so angry, he did not dare to hesitate and immediately went forward. Li Fengmu was also incomparably worried now. Bai Jian's breakthrough in the battle was indeed incomparably shocking. Even when he attacked, he even killed cultivators of the same realm. That kind of move could be said to be gorgeous. It was also because of his sword that more than half of the experts of the two clans were killed. However, after slashing out the 3,000 flying swords, Bai Jian seemed to have fallen and there was no sound. This also made Li Fengmu worried. If something really happened to him, then who would be the pillar of the Sword Heart realm in the future? Li Chuanyi? He was indeed a righteous person, but compared to Bai Jian, he still lacked some courage. The hope of the Sword Heart realm was naturally in need of special care. Moreover, in this battle, Bai Jian's contribution in killing the enemy was the highest apart from Princess Mingzhu. Not long after, Princess Mingzhu also returned. Those two beasts were too cunning. I couldn't eliminate them, Princess Mingzhu said with some regret. In Princess Mingzhu's opinion, if she could kill the two of them, then she could cut off all future troubles. However, if they were alive, they would still be a disaster. Hearing this, Li Fengmu only smiled indifferently and immediately fell to the ground. With Princess Mingzhu's return, his suspended heart could finally be at ease and he could have a good rest. Ancestor. Seeing this, many cultivators of the Sword Heart realm could not help but exclaim and hurriedly rushed over. Chapter 2251. Princess Mingzhu looked up and saw that Li Fengmu had fainted because of the battle. It wasn't a big deal and he only needed to rest well to recover. However, because of Li Fengmu's fainting, Princess Mingzhu began to hesitate. According to the previous agreement, she should return to Drifting Cloud World immediately after breaking the siege of Sword Heart World. But now that the Sword Heart World had lost its backbone, if she left rashly and came back blindly, no one in the Sword Heart World would be able to stop her. Let first and second elders send Sword Masterly back. Don't panic. The others continue to clean up the battlefield. Princess Mingzhu glanced coldly and said, seeing that Princess Mingzhu had spoken, everyone immediately calmed down and no longer panicked. Gradually, they began to carry out everything in an orderly manner. Xiao Yang, what's the situation on your side? Princess Mingzhu took out a token. There was no news on it. This spiritual vein was the Pisces token, the one in Emperor God's hands. When Emperor God was in seclusion, he gave the Pisces token to Princess Mingzhu so that they could contact each other in time and come up with a countermeasure. Princess Mingzhu had already passed on the news to Xiao Yang in a concise manner. However, she was also very distressed at the moment. The two almighties of Ash Wolf clan couldn't kill them all. Who knew when they would make a comeback? Therefore, Princess Mingzhu was basically confined to the place and couldn't leave at all. The current situation in Drifting Cloud World could only depend on how Xiao Yang handled it. Of course, Princess Mingzhu was also waiting for news. If Drifting Cloud World was really on the verge of collapse, she would still rush back. After all, once a hole was torn open, the consequences would be unimaginable. Moreover, Drifting Cloud World was mostly suffering from the enemy's main force. Sword Heart World was just a battlefield that the enemy used to drag their strength. Although they were well aware of all this, they still didn't feel the same. They could only be trapped there and couldn't rush to help. Although the triangular formation was wonderful, it seemed a little useless in a situation where one's strength was insufficient. It even restricted their mobility and dispersed their strength. Above Spring Sun City, Bailizi stood proudly in the sky, looking as unruly as ever. It was as if the previous injury was nothing to him. Therefore, he remained as calm as ever. Now that the sky had darkened, he looked at the human cultivator, and the smile on his face grew even wider, even a little sinister. Xiao Yang stood with his sword in hand. His expression had turned somewhat ugly at this moment, because he sensed that the enemy had already approached Pine, Victory Mountain. If that place was lost, it was likely that the defensive line led by Chu Taiyin and Xiao Changsheng would still be unable to hold on. Although the other party had not launched an attack yet, they had already set up camp. There were several second-order martial kings, and it was hard to say when they would make a move. No matter what, they could not lose Taste Victory Mountain. Once lost, the consequences would be unimaginable. When that time came, once they lost Taste Victory Mountain, the White Bear tribe would be able to directly invade and attack the root of the problem. When that time came, one area after another would be lost, and the destruction of the Drifting Cloud Realm would be foreseeable. Bailizi looked at the conflicted expression on the human cultivator's face and laughed. "Looks like you've already exhausted all your tricks. That's why you're making things so difficult." As he spoke, Bailizi became even more confident. From the current situation, he could tell that Xiaoyang was the backbone of this world, and the only pillar of support for this world. Once he fell, there would be no one in the Drifting Cloud Realm who could stop them. Thinking about it now, Bailizi felt that it was a pity. This person's talent was not bad, but it was a pity that he could not use him. Otherwise, the White Bear tribe's strength would definitely be greatly enhanced. When that time came, it was even possible for their status to rise to a higher level. Bailizi had already tried his best before, but he could not make the other party submit, so there was nothing he could do about it. Since he could not use it for himself, he could only destroy it and not leave any future troubles. Otherwise, with Xiao Yang's talent, once he escaped, he could go into seclusion for 1,000 years to cultivate. When that time came, it would be a nightmare for the White Bear tribe. I can still kill you." Xiao Yang's lips curled up as he smiled. If there was no victory or defeat in the past, Xiao Yang would not have said such big words. But now he could say so. Bailizi raised his eyebrows and even laughed out loud. He felt that this person's words did not match up at all. He was almost at the end of his tether, yet he was still able to say such words. His method of deliberately mystifying things was not bad. "All right, then I'll stand here and let you kill me. Let's see what other tricks you have," Bailizi said with a scornful smile. Bailizi was indeed very confident at the moment. At least, in his opinion, victory was already in his grasp. Furthermore, he also wanted to test Xiaoyang with such provocative words, to see if Xiaoyang was truly capable, or if he was just bluffing. As soon as he said that, Xiaoyang frowned. At the same time, the Thunderfire Divine sword in his hand glowed once again. Now he was ready to give it a try. If he could kill Bailizi, the invading army at the front line of Spring Sun City would no longer be a threat. However, Xiaoyang soon realized the problem. His sword was still lacking a little. It was not that he could not kill Bailizi, but that he did not meet the conditions to kill him quickly. It was possible to kill him, but it would take a long time. However, what Xiaoyang lacked now was time. The troops at Pine Victory Mountain seemed to have been reorganized and could launch an attack at any time. Moreover, Ji Fei was the only one guarding the front. Even with the support of the formation, it would be difficult to ensure that nothing would go wrong. In the end, Xiaoyang could only shake his head helplessly. He had to make a choice now. kill or retreat. In the past, Xiaoyang would definitely choose the former, but now it was difficult. I'm not free. Chapter 2252. When Bai Lizi heard this, a strange smile appeared on his face, because in his opinion, such an excuse was a little too childish. Or was it because his opponent didn't treat him as a human being? However, anyone with a slightly normal mind would not believe such words. This was truly a little too forced and unreasonable. However, as soon as Xiaoyang finished speaking, he immediately turned into a white streak of light and quickly retreated, leaving for Wangpin Victory Mountain. Since the Triumph Mountain had fallen into a crisis, he naturally needed to rush back quickly. Since he did not have the opportunity to kill his opponent, he could only stop before going too far. He could not force it. After all, there were some things that couldn't be forced. The big picture was more important. He could not lose everything because of temporary benefits. Xiaoyang's mind was very clear. He knew what position he was in and what he had to do. He did not dare to be careless. After all, this was related to the survival of the drifting cloud boundary. What's more, it was all tied to him. This kid is really a coward. He ran away just like that? Bai Lizi sneered. There was a hint of contempt in his eyes. When the White Bear warriors in Spring Sun City saw this, they were even more disdainful. Human cultivators really liked to talk big. Moreover, after saying that, they ran away with their tails between their legs. It was really despicable. Bai Lizi stopped for a while and did not find anything unusual. He said, "Let me see where you can run to." In the next moment, wherever Bai Lizi passed by, there was a flash of lightning. Bai Lizi did not act rashly because he knew the principle of not chasing a cornered enemy. If Xiaoyang played a trick, he might be in danger if he rashly chased after him. However, from his observation, Xiaoyang had really run away. It was not a premeditated plan. After confirming the truth, Bai Lizi no longer had any worries in his heart. In his opinion, this was a great opportunity. If he could grasp it tightly, he might be able to kill Lo Yangming. At that time, the credit for stabilizing the flowing cloud world would naturally be his. Bai Lizi's speed wasn't slow. He soon saw Xiaoyang, but it was difficult for him to catch up in a short time. Xiaoyang also sensed Bai Lizi's aura. He couldn't help but frown slightly. He didn't expect this guy to be so persistent. However, this was also normal. The other party felt that this was a great opportunity and naturally couldn't bear to miss it. Xiaoyang didn't care about him. Bai Lizi might not be able to catch up to him. On the peak of Pinching Mountain, Ji Fei looked coldly at the White Bear warriors below who were beginning to assemble after setting up camp. Obviously, after they finished setting up camp, they had already discussed countermeasures and were ready to launch an attack. Under such circumstances, Ji Fei naturally could not let his guard down. With a wave of his hand, the allied soldiers below also began to move and get into position after receiving the message. Of course, what these warriors could do even more was to stay in the eye of the formation and increase its strength and power. After all, once a martial emperor made a move, no matter how many people they had, it would be difficult to resist. However, if they contributed their strength to the formation, there would be a great change. It was also because of this that Pinching Mountain, as a place that had been in operation for a long time, was known as the last line of defense for a reason. It could be said that this place could contribute everyone's strength, which was the essence of it. No matter how many powerhouses there were, as long as the formation was not broken, Pinching Mountain would not fall. It could be said that too much hope had been placed in this battle. However, many people still had doubts in their hearts. How long could this formation last? After all, they were at an absolute disadvantage in terms of the number of martial emperors. They could only rely on the power of the formation to resist for a while and not be defeated directly. As more allied soldiers took their positions, the power of the formation began to gather. Ji Fei also immediately activated the formation and immediately focused his attention on the foot of the mountain. If the other party rashly attacked, he would be able to launch a counterattack immediately. As for how long they could hold on, it was up to fate. Whether or not they could hold on until Xiaoyang arrived, he could only try his best, since he could save the old prime minister. Ji Fei believed that this Almighty had the means to sense what was happening here and was not completely ignorant. However, what kind of opponent did Xiaoyang encounter? Ji Fei was extremely worried that he had not returned yet. Fine, let's see how powerful the 10,000 Hearts Joint Force formation set up by Lord Xiao is. Ji Fei muttered and scoffed. There were 6 people gathered at the foot of the mountain. 2 of them had a cultivation of stage 2, so they stood in front. It could be said that they were in charge here. The 4 people behind them were stage 1 martial emperors, but they were enough to look down on the drifting cloud boundary. Brother Bai, what did Mr. Bai say? The man in black smiled and asked. The man in white said, Big brother told me to do as I wish without affecting the overall situation. When the man in black heard that, he could not help but frown slightly. He was unhappy, but he did not show it. This person was called Bai Liguang, and he was from the same branch as Bai Lizi and the others. The one called Brother Bai was from the Bai family branch of the White Bear tribe. All along, the White Bear tribe had been divided into 2 branches, with Bai and Bailey as their surnames. In the Wanshou realm, they were originally from different places, but they were from the same tribe. In addition, the rules in the Wanshou realm were more cruel, so 10,000 years ago, the leaders of the 2 branches took the lead and merged the 2 branches. As a result, the White Bear tribe's strength increased greatly after the merger, and they barely became one of the top tribes in the Wanshou realm and had the right to speak. In the eyes of outsiders, the merger of the 2 branches was very successful, but there was still endless fighting inside. They all wanted to suppress each other and become the main branch. It was also because of this that the Bailey branch took the initiative to send people over. They wanted to use this opportunity to suppress the other party. However, who would have thought that the result would be a loss of soldiers and generals, which greatly damaged the Bailey branch's vitality? In the battle this time, even though the Bailey branch was more powerful, in the end, the Bai branch was the main branch. The previous failure forced Bai Liguang to swallow his anger. He had to ask around before making a decision. Chapter 2253. When Bai Yingfeng saw that Bai Liguang, whose cultivation was slightly higher than his, was so respectful to him, he felt comfortable. Moreover, he also understood that if it weren't for the huge mistake that Bailey's faction had made earlier, it was hard to say what the primary and secondary attack would be like this time. However, it was already good enough. Even the 3rd-level experts from the Bai tribe had come. There was no reason why they couldn't take down the drifting cloud boundary this time. At that time, the result of this battle would be the rise of the Bai family, and they would be able to completely suppress the Bailey family. Thinking of this, Bai Yingfeng felt comfortable in his heart. This kind of feeling could be said to be very good. They had always been at loggerheads with each other. Which one of them wasn't arrogant? But now, didn't they still have to be obedient? Bai Liguang seemed to have seen through Bai Yingfeng's thoughts. He felt terrible, as if he had eaten a fly. Now, he couldn't help but curse in his heart. Bailey Feng and Bailey Zhen, these 2 idiots. Because of their failure, their tribe had to swallow their anger and lose the right to be arrogant. Even though he was unconvinced in his heart, he could only lower his attitude and did not dare to flare up. Bai Yingfeng seemed to have seen this too. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, as if he didn't think too much about it. Or perhaps, in his opinion, all of this was just the Bailey tribe reaping what they had sown. That was why they had such an ending. All along, the Bailey tribe had the advantage in numbers and felt that they could dominate the entire White Bear tribe. Now it seemed that their power was gone. So what if they occupied half of the tribe? On this expedition to the drifting cloud boundary, they had also suffered heavy casualties. Brother Bai, what should we do about this? Bai Liguang suppressed the anger in his heart and asked carefully. There was no point in saying more now. How to take down the Taste Victory Mountain was the most important thing now. In this battle, the Bailey tribe could atone for their sins and their status could also rise. Moreover, Bai Liguang hated the drifting cloud world to the core. If it weren't for the fact that this small world was an anomaly that caused them to lose so many soldiers, how could they have suffered such humiliation? The cause of all this was the flowing cloud realm. They were the main culprits. Bai Yingfeng rubbed his hands and looked at the light that was gradually rising from Mount Exquisite Victory. The smile on his face grew wider, because, in his opinion, this was indeed a very interesting matter. Who would have thought that a newly ascended small world would have so many tricks up its sleeves? This was truly unexpected. However, it was normal. If this world wanted to continue to exist, then it naturally needed many life-saving methods. Only then would there be a chance to return. Moreover, the current situation wasn't that simple to begin with. However, what Bai Yingfeng did not expect was that the world had been waiting for them for a long time and had made ample preparations. This was something that was hard to fathom. Why would his opponent make such a decision? The more he thought about it, the more confused Bai Yingfeng became. Or could it be that this small world was too fearful of them? Since you and I are the vanguard and have already set up camp, we naturally have to wait for orders. Bai Yingfeng smiled. Bai Liguang frowned slightly when he heard this. It seemed that this was indeed a very safe method. Previously, Bai Lifeng had lost his life because of his own rash advance. If they made the same mistake again, then it would really be a joke. However, as the vanguard, we should also probe the opponent's background and see how strong they are. Bai Yingfeng frowned and shouted in a low voice. Bai Yingfeng was very unhappy because they had obtained it effortlessly in West Wind City. Everything had happened too smoothly. They had not fought with the native forces at all. Until now, they still had no idea how strong the enemy was. Under such circumstances, Bai Yingfeng was naturally unhappy. If they continued to probe the enemy's strength, they might be at a disadvantage in the future. When Bai Liguang heard this, he couldn't help but frown. At least, he felt that this was a good choice. Moreover, he had not been able to enjoy himself to the fullest during the previous pursuit. If they could break through the Victory Mountain while probing, it would be a great contribution. Since you are so anxious, Bai Liguang, you will be the vanguard and probe the situation first. Bai Yingfeng smiled. When Bai Liguang heard this, he hesitated for a moment before agreeing. He quickly led his men and rushed to taste Victory Mountain. Ji Fei saw the 3 martial emperors attacking and immediately gave the order for everyone to move. At this moment, the All Hearts Alliance formation was fully activated. Rays of light shot up into the sky and shone brightly. Right now, Bai Liguang felt extremely helpless in his heart. He also knew that he was probably just a pathfinder. However, he also wanted to take a gamble. What if he won? This small world strength was only SO. As long as that person did not show up, who could do anything to him? Bai Yingfeng watched as Bai Liguang attacked the formation. The smile on his face deepened. From Bai Yingfeng's point of view, since the enemy could set up this formation and take root here, it was obviously the real defense line. Moreover, even if that person was not here, this defense line would still be effective. Otherwise, why would the enemy put all their eggs in one basket and place all their almighties here? After a few exchanges, Bai Liguang's heart could be said to be extraordinarily astonished. Even his body was covered with injuries. Even though Ji Fei was only a level 1 martial emperor, with the help of the All Hearts Alliance formation, his strength was comparable to a level 2 martial emperor, or even stronger. This was the ingenuity of this formation. Otherwise, how could they have retreated so quickly and set up camp here? Whether it was in terms of geographical location or situation, MT Prestige was the best place. As long as they could defend this place, nothing would be a problem. After a few more exchanges, Ji Fei also saw 2 rays of light coming at him. He couldn't help but frown. This was because Xiao Yang was not the only one who came. There was another person behind him. Chapter 2254. If that person was able to chase after Xiao Yang, then how terrifying would his strength be? Ji Fei could not help but shudder when he thought of this. He originally thought he had something to rely on, but after seeing this scene, some of his thoughts began to waver. Even Xiaoyang was being chased and killed. Then, how terrifying would the strength of the enemy invading this time be? The more he thought of this, the more cracks appeared in Ji Fei's state of mind. After all, Xiaoyang could be said to be their only reliance. Once he was in a situation where he was not strong enough, many cultivators would be shaken because of him. By then, once the morale was low, they would be at a disadvantage. Then, there would be no way to win this war. In the end, Ji Fei was the only one who stood high enough to see further. At the same time, Ji Fei also believed that he was just worrying for nothing. Xiaoyang was not necessarily unable to defeat the enemy. He was just worried about the situation of Taste Victory Mountain, so he rushed back in a hurry and did not care so much. Actually, this made sense. After all, it was only after Bai Liguang made his move that Xiaoyang rushed over. Indeed, this formation could stop Bai Liguang and the other two martial emperors. If Bai Yingfeng also brought his people to join the battle, then it would be difficult for Ji Fei to defend Taste Victory Mountain with his own strength. Moreover, there might be reinforcements coming, or there might be hidden dragons and crouching tigers. Once a general attack was launched, it would be difficult to defend Taste Victory Mountain. Therefore, to ensure that nothing would happen to Taste Victory Mountain, Xiaoyang had to come personally. Only in this place would he feel slightly more comfortable. At the very least, with this uncertainty, it was enough to catch his opponents off guard and let them know that even though the flowing cloud world had ascended from a small world, it still had the strength to fight against them. Then, Ji Fei did not look at Xiaoyang. He focused on dealing with Bai Liguang and the other two. However, the attacks of the three martial monarchs had the advantage of the formation. Ji Fei's defense could also be said to be skillful, making it impossible for the three martial monarchs to break through. Bai Liguang, who had suffered losses in several battles, was now particularly anxious. This was a battle that allowed him to hold his head high. However, who would have thought that this strange formation was like a natural moat that stood in front of him that he could not cross at all? Could it be that he was going to fail this time? The more Bai Liguang thought about it, the more uncomfortable he felt. He was even furious. As for Bai Yingfeng, he was watching the show leisurely. Of course, he wasn't just standing there to watch the show. He was also observing the operation of the formation, hoping to find some flaws. It could be said that when the formation was activated, Bai Yingfeng had already sensed that it was not simple. If he couldn't crack it, it would be difficult for him to advance even half a step. As long as the formation was broken, the people in the mountain would be nothing more than chickens and pottery dogs. He could kill them at will without any difficulty. However, after such a long time, although Bai Yingfeng had been observing for a long time, he could not find any clues. This point also gave him a headache. Could it be that he really couldn't think of a good way to break it? Suddenly, Bai Yingfeng subconsciously frowned. He looked up and saw two rays of light rushing over. Bai Liguang, back off. A deep voice suddenly rang out. When Bai Liguang heard this, he was first stunned. Then, without hesitation, he fell down and retreated into the formation. The other two martial monarchs did not dare to hesitate and retreated as well. If it was someone else who said this, he would not have retreated. However, he knew that voice. It was Bai Lizi, the leader of the Bailey branch in this expedition to the drifting cloud boundary. Since he had spoken, there must be a reason. Therefore, Bai Liguang didn't dare to hesitate in the slightest. The slightest distraction would cause him to lose his life. As expected, after Bai Liguang retreated, the light appeared where he was previously standing. The youth held a red and white sword in his hand. He stood there like a towering mountain. After retreating, the corner of Bai Liguang's mouth twitched. He already knew that this person was the leader of the drifting cloud boundary, Xiaoyang. He did not expect him to come. Moreover, he was chased here by Bai Lizi. In fact, Bai Liguang's heart was still pounding and his hands were trembling. Just now, he did not feel any aura. Moreover, the other party was in the same realm as him. However, the aura he emitted was much stronger than his. As such, Bai Liguang finally understood why Bai Lifeng would be buried there. Suddenly, an uneasy thought flashed across Bai Liguang's mind. Since Xiaoyang appeared here, what would happen to Bai Li's hen, who purposely went to stop him? The more he thought about it, the more terrified Bai Liguang became. Could it be that this person was really a monster? They were in the same realm. But why was the other party so powerful? Thinking about this, Bai Liguang was even more confused. Too many problems had arisen, and it made him feel very uncomfortable. What was going on here? As for himself, what should he do then? The more he thought about it, the more worried Bai Liguang became. This small world was truly an anomaly. Bai Yingfeng frowned slightly. He began to examine the young man who was in the same realm as him. However, the more he looked, the more shocked he became. Bai Lizhen probably wasn't trying to evade the accusation to make himself feel better. It was because the opponent was really that powerful. They had only met face to face, and the result was still the same. If he faced the opponent head-on, would he have the ability to fight back? Bai Lizi also landed beside Bai Liguang. He was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and looked at Xiaoyang. In the previous battle, he had not been able to take him down directly. Now that he had come to his territory, it would not be easy to kill him. As a result, Bai Lizi had no choice but to weigh the pros and cons in his heart. After all, it was better to play safe. Xiaoyang glanced at them, and the corners of his mouth curled up. He said, "I'm back. You don't have to worry anymore." As soon as these words were spoken, many people immediately cheered. In an instant, their morale was greatly boosted. Chapter 2255. Ever since Princess Mingzhu rushed to the Sword Heart world, Xiaoyang was the one with the highest cultivation and strength in the drifting cloud world. In addition to his dazzling battle results, it made people feel that he was the backbone of the drifting cloud world. As long as he was around, the battle would become much easier. At least, they would have fewer brothers who would die, and they would not be utterly defeated. Ji Fei secretly heaved a sigh of relief when he heard Xiaoyang's relaxed tone. He felt that everything wasn't as bad as he had imagined. In fact, the situation was very good. No matter what, Xiaoyang had made it in time. As long as he was guarding the Taste Victory Mountain, there was no reason for the place to be breached. In fact, with the other party's current strength, it was entirely possible for them to launch a counterattack. However, it was not necessarily easy to launch a counterattack. After all, it was possible to defeat the enemy, but it would not be easy to reclaim the lost land. Ji Fei also suppressed his emotions. How to get through the current situation was the most important thing. As for other matters, they could not be considered at the moment. Moreover, no matter how much he worried, it did not seem to have much meaning. No wonder you were running for your life. So that's why. Bai Lizi said with a smile on his face. Bai Lizi knew very well that the other party was afraid of attacking the rat for fear of breaking the vases. He was afraid that something would go wrong here, so he retreated in time. He wanted this place to be as stable as Mount Tai. But you said you wanted to kill me, so why did I chase you? Now do you want to try? Bai Lizi said with a smile. As soon as he said that, the warriors of the White Bear tribe cheered, and their morale increased greatly. The other party's main general was provoked in such a way, which meant that he was not Bai Lizi's opponent. As such, the disparity in absolute strength would determine the other party's defeat. With this thought in mind, everyone's mood couldn't help but improve. Bai Yingfeng frowned slightly when he saw the situation. According to the plan, Bai Lizi should be in Spring Sun City right now to investigate the dangers. But now that he was here, it was beyond his expectations. Although the current invasion was led by the Bai branch, Bai Lizi was the second in command this time. He wasn't someone Bai Yingfeng could order around. Strength reigned supreme. The logic was that simple. Don't you think that it's easier for me to kill you here? The corners of Xiaoyang's mouth lifted slightly as he said. As he spoke, the divine sword in his hand glowed with fire and electricity. With the help of the 10,000 Hearts United formation, Xiaoyang's strength would be greatly enhanced. In this way, killing Bailey Z would naturally become much easier. In addition to the foreshadowing he had done earlier, this was indeed a great opportunity to kill him. It could even be said that he could not miss it. However, Xiaoyang could only pretend to be calm. After all, there were too many things that he needed to take into account. He couldn't act rashly. Hearing this, Bailizi frowned slightly. He looked at the mysterious light emitted from the mountain range, and his heart sank. He looked at the person on the mountain peak. He was only a first-level martial emperor, but with the help of the formation, he was able to block Bai Liguang and the other two and even injure them. From this, one could see how powerful the formation was. If they rashly attacked now, they might really fall into his trap. Now, Bailizi had even more things to worry about. It could be said that the opponent had the upper hand. If they started fighting now, they might not be able to compare to before. The more Bailizi thought about it, the more uneasy he felt. In Spring Sun City, not being able to kill him could be said to be the biggest mistake of all. This was like letting a tiger return to the mountain. There would be no end to it. Do you think I'm stupid? The corners of Bailizi's mouth lifted slightly as he said. Since they had analyzed the situation clearly, there was naturally no reason for them to continue rashly. Therefore, it seemed to be the safest decision to continue the stalemate and wait for the other army to arrive before making a decision. Thinking of this, Bailizi's heart calmed down a lot, and he concealed his aura. Xiaoyang felt helpless when he saw that his opponent had lost his will to fight. If Bailizi really wanted to fight, he would be killed in less than the time it took to brew a cup of tea. However, if his opponent didn't attack and didn't want to kill him, it was naturally impossible to kill him. Perhaps if he were to stake everything on a single throw, he might even expose his trump card. Of course, he couldn't reveal his trump card so easily. After all, this thing might have a miraculous effect at any time. I feel that there is indeed something wrong with your head. Xiaoyang used his words to provoke him. Since there were no conditions, he might as well create them. After all, there were many things that could only be known after trying. After Bai Liguang heard that, he was furious and shouted, "Brat, what are you saying?" However, Bailizi stopped him with one hand and smiled. "If you say so, then so be it." Bailizi was very calm at the moment. Moreover, he knew very well that, since his opponent had the upper hand now, he would naturally be eager to fight. Previously, the two of them were locked in a fight. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that they were evenly matched. But now his opponent had been strengthened. If he were to recklessly start a fight, he would be at a disadvantage. Since he was calm, Bailizi was happy for his opponent to do that. This meant that his opponent might be anxious, which was why he used such a crude method to provoke him. However, if he didn't accept the challenge now, it would be enough to make his opponent's plan fail. Moreover, if they fought, it wouldn't be considered as a defeat. Therefore, how to deal with it next was the most important. Pulling one hair would affect the situation as a whole, so how could he advance rashly? Xiaoyang stood there. He had complete control of the 10,000 Hearts Alliance formation and could receive support. However, his opponent chose to avoid the battle and didn't take the initiative to attack. This made him feel uncomfortable. Everyone listened to my order. Retreat 25 kilometers and set up camp immediately. Bailizi immediately ordered. After this order was issued, the White Bear tribe's camp immediately burst into an uproar. They were currently at the peak of their morale, so how could they retreat now? At the very least, it was difficult for them to understand. On the other hand, Xiaoyang's expression turned ugly again. This Bailizi wasn't simple. Chapter 2256. Currently, Bai Yingfeng's expression was extremely unsightly because setting up camp here was the result of his careful investigation. However, The mighty figure asked them to retreat as soon as he arrived. What kind of logic was that? At least, with his current knowledge, it was difficult for him to understand such a method. However, he was helpless and could only swallow his anger. Bai Liguang, on the other hand, looked at this elder in disbelief. What kind of logic was this to ask him to withdraw the army as soon as he arrived? At least, Bai Liguang could not understand. Wasn't such a method too sullen? Changing because of one person. Wouldn't that be a little too ridiculous? Are you deaf? Bai Liguang shouted angrily when he saw that everyone was unmoved. Following his shout, the warriors of the White Bear tribe quickly began to move. This was because, in their opinion, they still had to listen to the words of a mighty figure. Even Bai Yingfeng and Bai Liguang were frightened. They did not know what was going on, but they could only follow the order and began to command without any hesitation. Seeing that the other party had retreated, Xiao Yang felt even more helpless. Initially, he thought that if the other party set up camp here, he could still use his own methods to attack and make them suffer. At least he could advance and retreat in this place. However, if the other party retreated 50 miles, they would be out of the range of the 1,000 Hearts array. At that time, he could only look at the sea, helplessly, and feel powerless. Retreating so quickly? It seems like you still want to call yourselves the White Bear Tribe. You might as well change your name to the Black Bear Tribe. Isn't that perfect? Xiao Yang mocked. As soon as he said that, the warriors of the allied forces began to echo and laugh. At the same time, the warriors of the White Bear Tribe were even more furious after hearing that. Such a statement was a bit too much. There was no reason for them to do this. I don't know who retreated directly, but the West Wind City that was left behind became an empty city. They don't even have the courage to fight. Bai Yingfeng immediately replied after suppressing his complaints. At this time, Bai Yingfeng was more cautious about the enemy's provocation. Since Xiao Yang was so provocative, it meant that they were prepared. It was even possible that abandoning the city and fleeing was just a trap. The key to this trap was to let them attack the summit Victory Mountain and then use it to make an issue out of it. Now, Bai Yingfeng understood a little. In a situation where the situation wasn't clear enough and the main general hadn't arrived yet, they could only endure it and not dare to say anything more. After all, this battle formation was not as simple as showing off one's bravery. Previously, when Bai Lifeng did that, the entire army was almost wiped out. Learn from the mistakes of others and learn from the mistakes of others. In response to Bai Yingfeng's words, Xiao Yang only smiled and did not seem to mind. They were all sly old foxes. How could they change their deployment just because of some sarcastic words from the other party? That was simply impossible. Sometimes, it wasn't a bad thing to be a little patient. If he couldn't control his emotions well, he might ruin things. This was an extremely cruel war. It was not a child's play. Under Bai Yingfeng's command, the White Bear Tribe's warriors began to retreat in an orderly manner. They did not reveal any flaws. Bailey Z, on the other hand, stood there like a tall mountain. As long as the cultivators of the summit Victory Mountain dared to come out, he would make them suffer heavy losses. Of course, they were well aware of this. They had reached a tacit understanding. If you don't chase, I'll retreat properly. Well water does not interfere with river water. Both sides were wary of each other and knew where the advantages and disadvantages were. Why would they show off their courage? Moreover, the White Bear Tribe only needed to wait for reinforcements to arrive and they could counterattack in time. The ones who needed to worry now were the people of the flowing cloud boundary. After all, if they made a mistake, they would be doomed eternally. The White Bear Tribe could make many mistakes, but the flowing cloud boundary only needed one mistake to poke a huge hole in them. It was possible that they would not be able to make up for it. Everyone knew which was more important. Who would dare to take the risk? Xiao Yang watched as they retreated in an orderly manner. However, when he saw Bai Lizzie standing there unmoving like a mountain, he could only helplessly stop his train of thought. After all, there were some things that couldn't be changed so easily. Even so, the other party had begun to retreat. Xiao Yang did not dare to let his guard down. Perhaps Bai Lizzie's actions were just an illusion. Once he relaxed, he would face an extremely ferocious attack. With that thought, Xiao Yang became very steady. A momentary dispute of personal feelings was just a momentary pleasure. A war between worlds required the stability of a world. How could one act blindly without thinking? Bai Liguang was very restless. He was even a little restless. The most important reason for this was that he was unable to understand why such an order would be issued. Ji Fei, who was observing from the top of the mountain, also heaved a sigh of relief. A smile appeared on his face. As expected, after Xiao Yang arrived, everything stabilized. In fact, even the aggressive army had begun to retreat. It was indeed a very good choice to concentrate all the forces on Taste Victory Mountain. If their forces were too scattered, there would be too many places to guard. The consequence would be that they would be exhausted. Perhaps they would not be able to guard both sides. In a short while, the White Bear tribe's army had retreated to 50 miles away. They even began to set up camp in an orderly manner. It was obvious that this was an army that had done their best to kill. That was why they were so orderly. Even though he was unhappy, he didn't stop what he was doing. Seeing this, Bai Lizzie felt that it was about time. He said, "Xiao Yang, the moon is pretty good tonight." When Xiao Yang heard this, he was stunned. "However, I'm afraid you won't be able to sleep well tonight. After all, a long night is fraught with dreams. Who knows what nightmares might appear?" Bai Lizzie said in a teasing manner. After saying that, Bai Lizzie turned around and left. He even laughed loudly. His laughter was very arrogant and filled with provocation. Bai Liguang seemed to understand and laughed as well. Chapter 22:57. After saying those words, Bai Lizzie left with a big smile as if he had done something extremely carefree. In fact, he even seemed to be rather smug. As the saying went, one family was happy while the other was sad. Now that Bai Lizzie had left so happily, Xiao Yang's face turned rather gloomy. After all, what would happen next was still unknown. Moreover, the White Bear army seemed to have retreated by 25 kilometers, so this method could also ensure a safe distance. In fact, it could be said that Bai Lizzie was retreating in order to advance, which cut off many possibilities. Xiao Yang turned around and landed on the peak of the mountain, and he stood in front of Ji Fei. "Master Xiao, you're really capable. As soon as you appeared, you made the final decision and made those rascals fear you and retreat by 25 kilometers," Ji Fei said with a smile as he flattered Bai Lizzie. However, Ji Fei was indeed very relaxed at the moment. In his opinion, if it was not for Xiao Yang's timely appearance, who knows what kind of trouble would have occurred. He was like a stabilizing needle that could stabilize the minds of countless people. He only smiled in response to Ji Fei's flattery. Afterwards, he sat down on the rock and let out a long sigh. Today's continuous battles had also left him extremely exhausted. He did not show it previously because he was like an arrow on a bowstring. How could he dare to relax at all? If someone were to notice anything amiss, they might be swarmed by their opponents. If that happened, the situation would become terrible. Pretending to be calm was sometimes necessary. At least for them, that was the case, and they could not be careless. Seeing how tired Xiao Yang was, Ji Fei immediately stopped talking. His eyebrows were almost knitted together, and his expression became much more serious. "Are you all right?" Ji Fei looked around and asked in a low voice. Right now, Xiao Yang's dispirited state must not be seen by others. Otherwise, it would be hard to avoid worrying too much. This could not be ignored. After all, people's hearts were the most difficult to control. Xiao Yang shook his head and said, "I'm fine. I'm just a little tired. I'll be fine after resting for a while more." Hearing this, Ji Fei's heart calmed down a little. However, he was very satisfied with such an answer. After all, Xiao Yang was still human. First, he fought Bai Lizhen in the southern, distant Grotto Heaven. Then he fought Bai Lizzie in the Spring Sun City. He was not a machine. Naturally, he would be tired. Sometimes, Xiaoyang only needed to be here. Even if they did make a move, it was enough to convince countless people that they could win. This is only the first day. I wonder what other methods the other party will use to force us. Ji Fei also sighed and said, right now, Ji Fei was also having a headache. From the fact that the other party's main forces were marching on two fronts, and the fact that they had scattered a few small teams to sweep over, it was enough to tell that the other party's leader was not simple. It could even be said that the method used by the other party was to take down the two cities of West Wind and Spring Sun without shedding a drop of blood. This point alone was enough to make one ponder deeply and feel helpless. Furthermore, the person behind the scenes still hadn't shown himself. Just how strong was he? This point made Ji Fei begin to calculate in his heart. He was very conflicted and depressed. On the other hand, Xiaoyang acted as if everything was under his control. There was no need to worry, so much at all. Counter soldiers with arms, water with an earthweir. Looking at the other party's posture, I'm afraid they will launch a surprise attack tonight. It's going to be another sleepless night. Ji Fei said with a wry smile. The words that Bailey Z said when he left were to make them feel anxious. Although it was just a lie, and there was a great possibility that he would not make a move. But what if he did? As long as there was a tear, it would be very terrifying for them. If Summit Victory Mountain could be like an iron bucket and could not be broken in the slightest, it would be difficult for the other party to bypass this place. However, once there was a flaw, it would be difficult to continue to defend. And this was the place where they had to put in the most effort. If they retreated further, there would be no way to retreat. Just be careful. Xiaoyang rubbed his eyebrows and said, everyone could figure out this matter, but who could really predict the other party's thoughts? After all, it was better to be careful, and there would not be any mistakes. Ji Fei smiled and nodded when he heard that. He also understood that this was how it should be. But because the old Prime Minister is seriously injured, I'm afraid the defense at the back will be empty, Ji Fei said in a deep voice. This was also a problem that Ji Fei had been worried about all along. If Xiaoyang had not come in time, he would have started to mobilize the first lunar shadow to assist in the defense. Xiaoyang shook his head indifferently and said, it doesn't matter. You should stay here and observe their movements. At the very least, if they want to go around to the back, they won't be able to do it in a short time. I'll go and kill them. When Xiaoyang said this, he seemed very relaxed, as if he did not need to exert any effort at all. The corner of Ji Fei's mouth could not help but twitch. Only Xiao Gongzhu could make this war sound so simple. However, he also had the ability to do so. As long as the opponent was not a third-level martial emperor, they would not be his match. Where is the old Prime Minister? I'll go take a look, Xiaoyang said as he stood up again. Ji Fei pointed to the back and said, there, but he's not in a good condition. I heard from unrivaled God that he and Chu Nanfeng only managed to save his life after joining forces. Of course, this was difficult to confirm. However, they had too little time. After hurriedly taking care of things, they each returned to the defense line to avoid any mistakes. Xiaoyang nodded with a smile. He understood this as well and then turned to leave. Although he and the old Prime Minister had some conflicts, they were still allies after all. There was no need to go overboard. Moreover, Xiaoyang had the means to save the old Prime Minister. Naturally, he had to give it a try. After all, a martial emperor ally was very important to the drifting cloud realm. Once they lost him, it would be a huge blow to their strength. It might even affect the overall situation. After a while, Xiaoyang walked into a thatched cottage that had been built less than a month ago. He looked at the old Prime Minister who was lying on the bed and shook his head helplessly. The few Peak King Wu cultivators who were guarding this place were extremely anxious. Chapter 2258. Sect Leader Xiao, you're finally here. Please, you must save the Prime Minister. Seeing this, a cultivator immediately walked over with a pleading look in his eyes. Sect Leader Xiao, although the Prime Minister has a feud with you, He deserved it for not listening to your orders this time. However, we can't do without the Prime Minister now. Please show some mercy and help us." In an instant, several cultivators rushed over and began to beg Xiaoyang, hoping that he could save the Prime Minister's life. At the same time, these cultivators were ashamed and resentful. They knew that if the Prime Minister had listened to Xiaoyang's orders from the start, he wouldn't have ended up in such a state. At the end of the day, he was just reaping what he sowed. However, the people here were all disciples of the old Prime Minister. How could they watch him die with their own eyes? "Everyone, you're looking down on me. Xiaoyang, too vile." Xiaoyang waved his hand helplessly. The words of these people were really meaningful. It made people feel very uncomfortable when they heard it. It was a slip of the tongue. "We have gauged the heart of a gentleman with the yardstick of a villain. Please forgive us, Master Xiao." Everyone quickly began to apologize. They also felt that their previous words were indeed inappropriate. Since they had made it clear, they naturally couldn't say that again. At the same time, hope was ignited in their hearts. Since Xiaoyang had such an attitude, it meant that the Prime Minister could still be saved. This was enough to make them overjoyed. "All right, that's enough. You guys can leave first," Xiaoyang said in a deep voice. When the crowd heard this, they immediately took their leave. After all, the Prime Minister's survival depended on Xiaoyang's ability to a large extent. So how could they dare to say anything more? Xiaoyang didn't want to continue talking to these people, as it was meaningless. After everyone left, he quickly walked over and began to check on the Prime Minister's condition. After all, the Prime Minister's safety was the most important thing. If it could recover faster, then the defense line of the flowing cloud world would be a little stronger. Moreover, the drifting cloud realm had very few martial emperors to begin with. It could be said that they were in a state of insufficient strength. If there were no more reinforcements, it would be bad. The Prime Minister's condition was very bad. His internal organs were all shattered, and his bones were all broken. Even the spirit veins were somewhat affected, and the severity of the injuries made people raise their eyebrows. Although Unrivaled God and Chu Nanfeng had worked together to save the old Prime Minister's life, that was all there was to it. There was a limit to how long this slim chance of survival could last. Under the urgency of the battle situation, sometimes it was indeed impossible to care so much. "You're lucky to be able to survive Bailey Z's attack," Xiaoyang muttered as he helped the old Prime Minister up. He channeled his energy into the old Prime Minister's body to heal him. Although the old Prime Minister's injuries were so severe that his life was hanging by a thread, he still had a slim chance of survival. This allowed Xiaoyang to free up his hands and have a chance to tactfully save the old Prime Minister's life. Outside the cottage, the few cultivators kept pacing back and forth on the spot. They were very worried now. They did not know if Master Xiao could save the old Prime Minister's life. This was a question in their hearts. It was hard to be sure. At the same time, they believed that Xiaoyang could do it. After all, with his ability, it was not impossible for him to create a miracle. The tents where the White Bear Army was stationed had been completely set up. They were neat and tidy. Some warriors were even patrolling left and right to prevent enemy forces from sneaking in. In the main tent, Bailey Z sat in the second seat. Bai Liguang, Bai Yingfeng, and the other martial emperors sat on both sides. Since Mr. Bai had not arrived yet, the person in charge was naturally Bailey Z, who had the highest cultivation base. "Bai Yingfeng, you must have passed on the news here to Mr. Bai," Bailey Z said with a smile. Looking at Bailey Z's smile, Bai Yingfeng could not help muttering in his heart. He did not feel good about it. This was because, more or less, it felt like a punitive expedition. Sitting opposite him, Bai Liguang's eyes flickered. He was very unhappy, but he could only suppress it. "That's right," Bai Yingfeng said. After all, what was done. Why couldn't he admit it? Or could it be that Bailey Z dared to do something at such a critical juncture? Moreover, he would not work under Bailey Z in the future. What was there to be afraid of? When Bailey Z heard this, he smiled and nodded. It was as though he did not care much about this matter. "What do you think, Mr. Bai? What should we do?" Bailey Z asked with a smile. Bai Yingfeng was stunned. He did not expect Bailey Z to be so easy to talk to this time. Or was he plotting something in his heart and digging a hole for himself? Big Brother said that everything here is up to you to decide. Bai Yingfeng said. This was the truth. At this moment, Bai Liguang's expression became slightly better. This was more like it. Bailey Z nodded slightly and tapped his fingers on the table. He seemed to be thinking about what to do next. After all, as the leader, he had to be careful with every decision he made. Moreover, he had already fought with Xiaoyang and knew his background. Therefore, he needed to think more about it. His opponent had the support of the formation. He might even be able to suppress him. In Bailey Z's opinion, waiting for that person to come was the safest thing to do. "Brother, you said that a long delay will bring trouble. When should we send troops to harass them?" Bai Yingfeng asked. This was the message Bai Yingfeng read from Bailey Z's words. Bailey Jin shook his head and said, "Why should we go now? I'm afraid our opponent is waiting for us." Bai Yingfeng was stunned. What did he mean? He quickly figured out the crux of the matter. The Nahua language was only used to trick the opponent. It kept them in a state of nervousness and vigilance. If there was a moment of relaxation, it would most likely be the moment when they would be attacked en masse. "Then what should we do?" Bai Liguang muttered unhappily. Bailey Z rolled his eyes and said, "It's a beautiful night. Of course, we'll have a good dream." Chapter 2259. After 2 hours of hard work, the old Prime Minister's life was finally pulled back from the gates of hell and his injuries were completely stabilized. Xiaoyang did not continue to stay there. Instead, he left a few bottles of elixirs for the people of the God Realm to take care of the old Prime Minister. After this incident, the majority of the people in the God Realm had a drastic change in their opinion of Xiaoyang, especially the disciples of the old Prime Minister. They were deeply grateful to him. Xiaoyang did not go anywhere else. Instead, he went directly to the peak of the mountain. Because Ji Fei was watching over here, he was very assured. And because he was really tired, he decided to rest here. As for whether the situation would change tonight, Xiaoyang did not care so much. If he did not rest for a long time, it would be difficult for him to recover to his peak state. That would be a worse situation. At that time, even if Bai Lizi launched a surprise attack, Ji Fei would wake him up in time and deal with it. One night passed. It could be said that the wind was calm and the waves were calm. Nothing happened. From this point, it could be seen that the opponent's words yesterday were just a bluff and deliberately mystifying. As the saying goes, attacking the heart is the best. It is difficult to distinguish between what is true and what is false. Everything that was done now was just to pave the way for the war in the future. After a night's sleep, Xiaoyang's condition was more or less recovered. Since Ji Fei did not wake him up last night, it meant that nothing happened last night. Therefore, there was no need to think about it anymore. At this time, Xiaoyang took out the Pisces token. He received Princess Mingzhu's message and immediately replied. At least for the time being, the flowing cloud boundary could be said to be safe. Since the sword heart boundary was a little unstable, they could just stay there. After all, the flowing cloud boundary was not the only place in this war. The sword heart boundary was equally important. It needed experts to guard it. It could not be careless. "Do you want to rest for a while? I will watch over here," Xiaoyang said indifferently. Ji Fei shook his head and said, "Yesterday I only operated the formation for a while. It is nothing. You, on the other hand, should rest more now that you have time. Otherwise, when the battle starts, I'm afraid you won't be able to rest for even a moment." Ji Fei was also well aware of this. From the invasion of the distant southern paradise, it could be seen that the other party's thoughts were indeed not simple. It was very difficult to say what kind of actions they would take in the future. Xiaoyang smiled and shook his head, saying, "I'm fine, I've almost recovered." Ji Fei just nodded and didn't continue speaking. After all, Since Xiaoyang had already made a decision, it would be meaningless to continue talking. Since that was the case, he might as well keep his mouth shut and let the two of them have some peace and quiet. It wasn't that Ji Fei wasn't tired, he just felt that Xiaoyang was more tired, so he needed to rest more. However, it must be known that controlling the 10,000 Hearts United formation was also an extremely exhausting task. However, in this matter, he had no choice but to do so. Because there was no movement last night, Xiaoyang and the others were especially vigilant today. They couldn't say when the enemy would launch an attack, so it was better to be careful. After all, there were some things that needed to be taken seriously, and the slightest mistake couldn't be allowed. However, on this day it was still calm and peaceful. Nothing happened. This made people feel a little depressed and puzzled. The enemy seemed to have completely given up, and they were terrifyingly calm about the invasion. However, it seemed to be a good thing that they didn't take the initiative to launch an attack. At least they still had a chance to breathe. If they waited until Princess Mingzhu completely eliminated the threat of the Sword Heart world, they could gather their forces and drive away the White Bear tribe's army. In the next few days, the White Bear tribe seemed to have completely quieted down, and there wasn't the slightest sound. Because of this, the entire alliance couldn't help but start to speculate about the enemy's plans and schemes. Sword Heart World, Sky Sword Sect. A man in white with a jade-like temperament was lying on the bed. Beside the man sat a group of people who had been guarding this place for a few days. Li Fengmu, who had fainted due to serious injuries, had already woken up and was guarding this place with an anxious expression. Because the person lying on the bed was the future hope of their Sword Heart world, Bai Jian. In the previous battle, Bai Jian could be said to have fought against a group of heroes, and even used 3,000 flying swords to kill several cultivators of the same realm. His battle record could be said to be very dazzling. However, because of this, he had almost exhausted his mental and physical strength, so he collapsed at the moment of victory. Li Chuanyi, who was standing at the side, blamed himself. He felt that if he was a little stronger, he might be able to help senior brother a little, and it wouldn't have to be like this. Sword Masterly, don't worry. Bai Jian just fainted because of mental and physical exhaustion. He will be fine after some rest. Princess Mingzhu glanced at him and said softly. Li Fengmu chuckled. Naturally, he knew about this. However, this was not the reason that he was worried about. Suddenly, Bai Jian coughed violently a few times and sat up in shock, as if he had been awakened from a nightmare, and his head was covered in sweat. When everyone saw Bai Jian's condition, their faces were immediately filled with joy. As long as he was fine, that was enough. After Bai Jian woke up, his eyes suddenly became a little dull. He looked at his slightly trembling hands, and his aura became a little dead. Seeing Bai Jian's expression, Li Fengmu couldn't help but feel a pain in his heart, and he felt extremely uncomfortable. Princess Mingzhu, who was at the side, also shook her head helplessly. Previously, she had also seen the 3,000 flying swords, so Princess Mingzhu also sincerely admired Bai Jian. It was a pity that heaven was playing tricks on people, and no one could resist it. However, this didn't affect the fact that Bai Jian was a man. Li Chuanyi also lowered his head, helplessly. In this room, everything seemed to have fallen into silence, and even the sound of breathing could be heard. However, Bai Jian's mental journey was extremely noisy at this moment, and he was even more shocked. Scenes of the past kept appearing, and hope and despair seemed to be alternating with each other, making it impossible to distinguish which was reality and which was illusion. It seemed that all of this was reality, but there was a problem with the sequence. In other words, I failed when I broke through at the last moment. After a long time, Bai Jian muttered as if he was whispering.